Welcome back to World Religions. This is a video series to accompany a semester-long survey of world religions course. This video is a survey and intro to Judaism. I also have a longer video on Judaism as part of my Western religion series. It's about twice as long. We're going to look at 5 main sections. First, an overview of Jewish theology and what Judaism means as an identity and as a religion. Then some historical sections, first covering Ancient Judaism in section 9.2. Then Rabbinic Judaism in section 9.3. That's the history of Judaism since the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans. And then we'll look at some Jewish practices and festivals, and then we'll conclude with a survey of modern Judaism, its history in the last couple hundred years. 9.1 Overview. In this section, we're going to look at what it means to be a Jew and basic Jewish theology and other doctrines. So first, let's look at some terminology, the words Jews, Judaism, and Israel. The word Jew usually refers to an ethnic group. It can also refer to people who have the religion of Judaism. When used to refer to an ethnic group, it's an ethnic group that speaks traditionally Hebrew, a Semitic language related to Arabic and other languages of that family. The origins of the Jews lie in the Middle East, in the land of Judah or Judea, as it was known, for example, under the Romans. Judaism is the religion of most ethnic Jews throughout their history. It originates in the teachings and covenants of ancient patriarchs and prophets, such as the patriarchs Abraham and Moses, and the prophets Elijah, Isaiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, and others. There's also Israel, which has 4 main meanings. It goes back to Jacob, also called Israel, who was a patriarch and ancestor of the 12 tribes that later became the main components of the kingdom of Israel. The ancient kingdom of Israel in its earlier stage is known as the United Monarchy. This was when all 12 of those tribes, each of those tribes traced its descent to one of the 12 sons of Jacob, but they were ruled together by a single king in a succession. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. Historically speaking, there are some ancient inscriptions of kings in that part of the world who claim to be of the house of David or descendants of David. So David was largely regarded as the founder of that kingdom. Its capital was at Jerusalem. At some point, however, a few generations after the time of David, the northern part of Israel split off into its own separate kingdom. So there was a divided monarchy between the northern kingdom that was still called Israel and the southern kingdom that became known as Judah or Judea, named after the tribe of Judah, which was its largest constituent. Eventually, though, the northern kingdom was conquered and mostly destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. A lot of the Jews in the north were forced into exile, and they were basically lost to history, probably assimilating with other populations. There were a people remaining in the north who may be connected to the Samaritans. There are still a few Samaritans who survive to this day. They kind of regard themselves as the modern descendants of that northern kingdom of Israel, and it's at least possible that is true, historically speaking. Finally, the name Israel can refer to the modern state of Israel, which is a modern nation state founded by Jewish migrants to the former territory of Ottoman and then British Palestine. The majority of the population of Israel is Jews, but there are also many Arabs, most of whom are Muslim or Christian. Many, but not all, of the ethnic Jews of the modern state of Israel practice Judaism. So there's basically this proliferation of terms. It can be a bit ambiguous. Jew can refer either to someone who's ethnically Jewish or to someone who's religiously Jewish or both. Jews worship and mostly believe in only one God. Earlier in their history, they may have been monolatrous, but not strictly speaking monotheistic. Monolatry means only worshiping one God, but believing or potentially believing that there are other gods that exist. This is sometimes claimed by modern scholars when they interpret or reconstruct the early history of Judaism, that the early Jews may have been monolatrous and then at some point they became monotheistic, i.e., believing that only one God really exists. You can see the monotheism of Judaism in the Shema prayer from the book of Deuteronomy. Quote, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord," unquote. That particular verse is the beginning of a Shema prayer from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. God is thought of as omniscient or all-knowing, omnipotent or all-powerful, and as omnipresent, present everywhere in the creation. God is also thought of as transcending the creation, however, as being uncreated and not depending on anything else for its existence. A lot of these terms were from later theology and philosophy. The theology, as it was developed by Moses Maimonides, a medieval Jewish philosopher and theologian, is broadly similar to that of Christianity and Islam, as they developed in the period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So basically the Middle Ages up to around the European Renaissance. A lot of these terms and concepts were kind of ironed out. So the theology of the one God in Judaism is similar to that of Christianity or Islam, but Jews have many particular beliefs about the status of the Jewish people, and so forth. God is regarded as eternal, having no beginning or end in time, sometimes interpreted as being outside of time. God is also regarded as the creator, as being the being that created heaven and earth and also humanity. You can see the picture on the slide is a modern digital reconstruction of the Ark of the Covenant. This was believed to be the dwelling place of God in ancient Judaism, starting in the time of Moses, during the exodus of the Jews from Egypt, from slavery under the Egyptian pharaohs to freedom in the Promised Land. And this was originally in a temporary tent or tabernacle that could be moved around as the Jews moved around. Eventually, the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the temple in Jerusalem that was built by King Solomon. A bit more about how Jews tend to think of God's omnipotence and omniscience. Omnipotent means all-powerful. For example, God can perform any miracle that essentially he wants, thus breaking or going beyond the laws of nature. One example of this is the patriarch Abraham, whose wife Sarah was very old, and they both thought she was too old to conceive a child, despite God's promise that Sarah would give birth to a son who would go on to be the chosen people of God. And sure enough, despite being very old, Sarah was able to conceive Isaac, who basically, according to Jews, inherit the covenant with Abraham. Abraham was one of the first patriarchs of the Jews. His name means the father of nations, and Jews believe that in addition to being the father or ancestor of Jews, he was the father or ancestor of other nations too, such as through his other son Ishmael, whose descendants include the Arabs. Maimonides, the medieval Jewish theologian, in his book Guide for the Perplexed, argued that God cannot, however, do anything that's logically impossible, i.e. anything logically contradictory. This shows, despite the differences in philosophy and theology in some of the medieval philosophers that you see in Judaism as opposed to Christianity or Islam, respectively, they did have some shared beliefs about God. This understanding that God couldn't do anything logically contradictory was a fairly widespread view among the Abrahamic or monotheistic religions. In terms of God's omniscience or being all-knowing, his knowledge is not thought of as limited by space and time. For example, these two verses from the book of Psalms, chapter 33, quote, "The Lord looks down from heaven, he sees all the sons of men." That's verse 13 from chapter 33 of Psalms. And it continues, "He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds," end quote. That is verse 15 from the same chapter. So God has foreknowledge of all events, but most Jews believe that humans still do have free will. In the Mishnah, or the collection of the oral Torah, this is, according to Jewish tradition, a teaching from Moses that wasn't written down at the same time as the Torah or law of Moses. But it says in Mishnah, quote, all is foreseen, but freedom of choice is given, unquote. The philosopher Maimonides argued that humans are unable to comprehend the nature of God's knowledge because it is of a different kind from that of human knowledge. And thus, humans are unable to understand how divine foreknowledge is compatible with free will, and yet he argues that is the case. The picture on the slide is of Abram and Sarai. These became known as Abraham and Sarah after they made their covenant with God. God is regarded as eternal, as having neither beginning nor end. The Talmud is a later collection of teachings, commentaries by rabbis on the Jewish scriptures and the Mishnah. The Talmud says that there's an unbridgeable gap between God and humans, and that can be reflected in part by the nature of God's eternal being. The Midrash, or commentary, affirms God's eternal reign, but discourages over speculation about God's eternity. The Mishnah, or oral Torah, says, quote, whoever reflects on four things, it were better for him that he had not come into the world. What is above, what is beneath, what is before, and what is after, end quote. So there's kind of an overall theme here in the later Jewish understanding of God and of the scriptures that there's a limit to what humans can understand about the nature of God, the fundamental nature. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, argued that time itself is part of the creation per se, and thus it is not correct to say that God existed before the creation, because time only applies within the creation. Joseph Albo, in his Ikarim from the 15th century, argued that terms indicating duration or location in time cannot be applied to God, so similar concept to that of Maimonides. And he argued that temporal concepts can only be applied to God in a negative sense, so that God is not non-existent before, during, or after a particular time. This is an example, by the way, of negative theology, which was pursued by some traditional Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theologians. Some Jewish thinkers say that God is outside time in an eternal now, quote unquote, such that God experiences all the past, the present, and the future of the creation simultaneously and eternally. The picture on the slide is just of a possible early depiction of the God of the ancient Israelites or Jews. You can see he's named by the tetragrammaton, or four letters, YHWH. This is from an ancient coin. You can see the wheel that has a wing and a bearded figure seated on the wheel. The wheel symbolizes the chariot, the heavenly chariot of God, which can fly around, hence the wings. It's at least part of what the symbolism is. You can also see that the bearded figure has a bird in one of his hands. This is not identical to, but it's similar to some of the imagery of visionary prophets like Ezekiel when they describe God's celestial chariot. But in Judaism, early on, there developed a commandment against creating graven images of God. So in their main tabernacle and later in their temple, the Jews did not have an icon or an image of God, rather just the Ark of the Covenant that contained the tablets of the law. There were visual depictions of cherubim or angels, but the space where God was believed to dwell was just an empty space above or between their outstretched wings. So there's a notion in Judaism that God transcends any form or picture that you could limit him by. And that's also probably related to the concept of God as transcending time in the eternity. In terms of the view of God as creator, God is regarded as having created heaven, earth, and humanity. The fact that God created the whole world, including the heavens and the earth, means there's a kind of principle of unity, at least in terms of causation, of the entire cosmos. God is also believed by Jews to have created humans in his own image. This is described in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah, or the Law of Moses. So the same book that's also part of the Christian Old Testament. There are actually two accounts of the creation of man, one in Genesis 1, chapter 1, the other in Genesis chapter 2. In the first account, God creates the man and the woman at the same time, or so it would seem. In the second account, he creates first the man, Adam, and then from his side or his rib or his curve, there's different translations of it, the first woman, Eve. And the belief is that all humans are descended from this original couple, insofar as they were created in God's image. Thus, all humans share the divine image and have a kind of unity or equality on that basis. There's also a concept of providence in Judaism, which in Hebrew is called hashgacha. This is that God controls and guides the universe. For example, in the book of Psalms, chapter 33, verse 14, it says, quote, "From where he sits enthroned, he looks forth on all the inhabitants of the earth," unquote. That does seem to have the connotation that God is at least overseeing and perhaps guiding what happens on earth. Jews often regard God as the judge of the world, as deciding the destiny of individuals and nations. You can see a lot of examples of that throughout the Tanakh or Hebrew Bible. Jews also regard themselves as the chosen people of God. This goes back to God's covenant with Abraham and with later descendants of Abraham. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 7, verse 6, it says, quote, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples that are on the face of the earth," unquote. So the nation or kingdom of Israel has a mission to, quote, "keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice," unquote. And that latter passage is from Genesis chapter 18, verse 19. There's a lot of scriptures that are part of the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible. Tanakh is a Hebrew name, the three consonants of which, T, N, and K, at least those are the Roman names of those consonants, but they're an abbreviation for the three main parts of those scriptures. The T stands for Torah, the N stands for Nevi'im or prophets, and the K stands for Ketuvim or writings. So the oldest part of the Tanakh is the Torah or the Law of Moses. Most Jews believe that God directly revealed the Torah to Moses on Mount Sinai. And in Rabbinic Judaism, which is the most common type of Judaism, this is based on the teachings of the rabbis after the end of a Second Temple period. And it kind of, Rabbinic Judaism basically forms in the first few centuries AD, after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and forced a lot of the Jews in the province of Judea to go into exile. But they believe that there was also an oral Torah that was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai, and they have their own version of that. That's an important source of commentary and interpretation on the written Torah. The written Torah of Rabbinic Judaism is essentially the same as that used by Christians in the first part of their Old Testament. The Torah includes the first 5 books of the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible. The prophets or Nevi'im include later prophetic writings that were given to various individuals by means of prophecy, such as prophets like Samuel, Elijah, and later prophets like Daniel, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Habakkuk. There's a whole lot of them in the Tanakh. The book of writings or Ketuvim is a miscellany of different types of texts, such as the Psalms attributed to King David, the book of Job, and many others. These are all believed to have been divinely inspired by means of the Holy Spirit to their authors, rather than prophecy. So there's this different type of revelation: direct revelation to Moses, prophecy to people like Daniel and Elijah, and then inspiration by the Holy Spirit for the authors of the writings. The oral Torah consists of expositions and elaborations of the written law that Rabbinic Jews believe were revealed by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. They include additional legislation that was developed and transmitted through later generations of rabbis, historically speaking. The picture on the slide is a later interpretation of the revelation to the prophet Moses on Mount Sinai of the commandments. Moses is kind of like both a prophet and a patriarch. He leads the Jews out of slavery in Egypt to the promised land, at least in their period of wandering before they reach the promised land. But the Torah, or the 5 books to Moses, are revealed to Moses when he goes to Mount Sinai to kind of commune with God. And so Jews believe that those Mosaic law books of the Bible, the Torah, are actually divinely authored and just revealed to Moses. So there's much more we can say about the role of scriptures and texts in Judaism. Judaism is often called a scriptural religion because its main teachings are based on its holy scriptures. Modern scholars often think that an important role was played by some of the later kings of Judah, so that's during the divided monarchy period, such as King Josiah, who reformed an earlier religion that might have been polytheistic or at least less clearly monotheistic. Again, this is more of a modern scholarly interpretation, but it is mentioned in the Tanakh that King Josiah, during his reign, they discovered a book of the law in the wall of the temple in Jerusalem. So this could have been the book of Deuteronomy or the second law, or it might have been an early form of the Torah. It's kind of disputed historically speaking. But regardless, the books of the Torah, or sorry, the books of the Tanakh, this is falling under the section known as the prophets. This is like the chronicles of the kings of Judah, basically. They include stories of the Jews slipping back into worshiping other gods, that being condemned by prophets, and so they have to continually try to stamp out the Jews betraying God by worshiping other alleged gods and returning to the practice that was given to Moses on Mount Sinai that was meant to be binding on the Jews. So Josiah and some of the other kings of Judah are basically interpreted by Jews as reestablishing the religion that was revealed to Moses. Some modern scholars look at that as they're actually constructing or fabricating a religion that's monotheistic that was later attributed back to the time of Moses. So there were also an important role played by scribes. These were people who copied the Torah but also studied it. Many of them were regarded as having a special authority to teach. The word Reb or rabbi refers to a teacher of the Tanakh. Scripture became even more important for the religion after the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So that meant that the old sacrifices given to God in the temple could no longer be performed. And so the religion became more focused on observing all of the commandments that were part of the Torah and the covenant that was established with the Jewish people through the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai. So there developed more halachot or observances that were interpreted and argued for by various rabbis over the centuries. For example, modern halachot include rules about the proper treatment of books. So overall, we can talk about 3 main groups of texts that are used in Judaism. The scriptures proper are the Tanakh, including the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, as previously discussed. That's what you could call the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Bible. The second group of texts is the Mishnah. These are various tractates and regulations on the law. This is also called the oral law. And then thirdly, there's the Talmud, which are commentaries or midrash on both the Torah and the Mishnah. So a bit more about the Tanakh. The first part, Torah, includes the 5 books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis tells the history of the world from the creation up to the point where the Jews migrate to Egypt to escape a famine. Exodus talks about their liberation from their later enslavement by the pharaohs of Egypt, and God leading them, forming a new covenant with Moses, where the Jews become the chosen people of God that are supposed to worship him in a certain way, follow certain laws or commandments. And then the Jews are led to the promised land of Canaan, which later becomes the kingdom of Israel. Leviticus is another book of the law. Numbers includes laws, but also a kind of list, you could say, of the main tribes and population of ancient Israel. And then Deuteronomy means second law, so it's a kind of restatement of the law that was revealed to Moses. May have been a later version of the law. Some scholars say it was the text that was quote unquote rediscovered during the time of King Josiah, for example. But all of those books traditionally are attributed to Moses by Jews. The second part of the Tanakh, the Nevi'im, or prophets, are divided into two main parts, the former and latter. The former prophets include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. This tells about the establishment and the early kings of the ancient kingdom of Israel. The latter prophets include two main groups themselves, major and minor. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. The minor prophets are Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So the latter prophets, they include new teachings, such as about the coming of a Messiah or anointed king who will restore the kingdom of Israel and usher in a kind of new age, a new covenant, and a new kingdom of God. Then finally, there's the Ketuvim, or writings. These include some books that are more ancient, like the Psalms, as well as books that are not quite as ancient, and books like that of Daniel that include prophecy. So all told, the Ketuvim include Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Sometimes the word Torah, even though it strictly speaking refers to the books of Moses, can also be used to refer to the Tanakh as a whole, and sometimes it can also be used to refer to the oral Torah that Rabbinic Jews believe was also revealed to Moses on Sinai. Another term that's useful is megalot. This is referring to the 5 books from the writings that are read cyclically during the festivals as celebrated in Rabbinic Judaism. For example, the book of Ruth is read at the Harvest Festival. So how was this canon or authorized collection of scriptures compiled? There were an ancient version used that only included the Torah, and one of the ancient factions or parties of the Jews in the Second Temple period, known as the Sadducees, only regarded the Torah as canon. They didn't accept the writings or the prophets. But the Pharisees accepted all 3 of those parts of the Tanakh as scripture, and they came to dominate Judaism after the temple was destroyed. The Sadducees were more associated with the priesthood and the temple itself, the Pharisees with the rabbis and the scribes. So that rabbinic form of Judaism focused on Torah study and obeying the commandments and the halachot. That became prominent after the temple was destroyed by the Romans. The Jewish canon was closed after the destruction of the Second Temple, and that led to the development of Rabbinic Judaism, but there were new texts that were added, like the Talmud, that was compiled over many centuries of commentary and interpretation by later rabbis. The Rabbinic Tanakh that was established after the destruction of the Second Temple did omit some books that previously had been collected in an earlier translation of the Tanakh into Greek called the Septuagint. That had been done by some Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt, who were using Greek as their main language. The Septuagint Bible was used by ancient Christians, and that's why some modern Christian Bibles, mainly those of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, have some books in them that are not present in the modern Rabbinic Tanakh. A very important concept in Judaism as well is mitzvot, which means commandments. According to Rabbinic Judaism, God revealed 613 commandments to Moses. All of those can be found in the Torah. There are 2 main types of mitzvot: ritual performances and ritual laws. The ritual performances are various obligations between humans and God. The ritual laws are ones that would have been adopted by society even if they had not been decreed by God. So, for example, the ritual performances included rules for sacrifice, how to perform sacrifice, what types of sacrifices to perform to God at the temple. Jews regard the mitzvot and the Mishnah and the Talmud as being binding on all Jews for all time. At least that's the case with Rabbinic Judaism. The Karaite Jews, which are a minority, they don't accept the Mishnah and the Talmud, but only rather the Tanakh. It's a common belief in Judaism that every person has two tendencies, Yetzer HaTov, which is an inclination to the good, but also Yetzer Hara, an inclination to the evil. And that's why there has to be these laws, these mitzvot for humans to follow so that they can control the evil inclination and only give freedom essentially and to nurture the good inclination. Jews have an eschatology or theory of the afterlife and end of time that can be found in the prophets. Not all modern Jews really believe in this or emphasize it, but you can find all these beliefs in the Tanakh. So a lot of the theory of eschatology in Judaism relates to the Messiah, which means anointed one. This is the English way of spelling and pronouncing Mashiach, which is the Hebrew pronunciation. It refers historically to the anointed kings of Egypt. Like you can see the picture on the slide, the prophet Samuel anointing King David. This was a ceremony that basically indicated that God was approving of the rule of one of these ancient kings. So the Mashiach is supposed to restore the kingdom of Israel, so he's going to be anointed like the ancient kings of Israel. The belief is that at the end of time, God will send the Messiah to restore Israel, save the Jews, and usher in a new age, which will be characterized by peace. This is referred to by Isaiah and other prophets of the Tanakh. And for example, there's some that even appear to predict the timing of the Messiah, as you can see, for example, in Daniel. So there's also traditions about Messiah in the Midrash and the Talmud. The later rabbis that authored the Midrash and specifically the Babylonian Talmud, that's the collection of commentary, the particular Talmud that's most used by Rabbinic Jews. There's also the Palestinian Talmud or the Jerusalem Talmud. But these rabbis developed a more elaborate eschatological scheme that divided the end times into several stages. First, there would be an age of decline and calamities. Then there would be a messianic age. This would be an ideal kind of like new golden age in which Jerusalem would be rebuilt and essentially every human wish would be fulfilled. But eventually the messianic age would itself come to an end. This is when there would be a resurrection and universal judgment of all humans, including of the dead. The righteous will enter heaven or Gan Eden, the paradise, for eternity, and the wicked will be condemned to everlasting punishment in Gehinnom, or Gehenna, as it's also known in English. This is basically hell. So the ideas of Gan Eden and Gehinnom, of heaven and hell, those are rooted in the prophecies of the Tanakh. You can see how there's similar beliefs about the afterlife and the end of days between Judaism and Christianity and Islam. Now we're going to look at a historical survey of Judaism. Section 9.2 I'm calling Ancient Judaism, so it's covering the period from the first patriarchs and covenants of the Jews up to the end of the Second Temple period. Judaism has its origin in a lineage of prophetic patriarchs who entered into covenants with God. Patriarch means a male leader. The patriarchs include Adam, the first man, Noah, the survivor of the great flood. You could look at Adam and Noah as the ancestors of all humans rather than the Jews specifically. But with Abraham, whose name means father of nations, you see God creating special covenants with the ancestors of the Jews, Another example is the covenant renewed with Isaac, the son and heir of Abraham. A covenant is a sacred contract which cannot be broken. You could think of it as a kind of perpetual contract. So God made a covenant with Noah that's called the Noahide covenant, in which God promised to never again send a flood to destroy the whole world, and he also gave laws to humans. Noah, according to the book of Genesis, was the sole survivor of a great worldwide flood that God sent to punish all of the men, all of the descendants of Adam and Eve, because of their great sin, because of their iniquity. Jews, many or at least some rabbinic Jews, regard the Noahide covenant as still binding on all non-Jews. So they might think ideally Jews have this special covenant with God through Abraham and then Moses, but non-Jews are still subject to the Noahide covenant. Then the Abrahamic covenant is one in which God promised to make Abraham's descendants into a great kingdom who would rule the promised land of Israel. And the covenant was sealed through circumcision, or cutting off the tip of the foreskin of the penis of Abraham and his male descendants. This is still a practice of Jews today, and it marks membership in the Jewish religion. So the circumcision was started with Abraham. You could look at it as the first step in making the Jews a separate people from that of other ancient peoples. There were some other ancient peoples who had different versions of male circumcision as part of their culture, but it was something that was very distinctive of the Jews specifically as well. The Mosaic covenant was between God and Moses, or was revealed to Moses, you might say. According to this covenant, the Israelites, so this was basically all the people who were migrating out of captivity or slavery in Egypt to the promised land, they were a chosen people who would follow God's commandments that were revealed to Moses as part of this covenant, as part of the Mosaic law and the Torah. And they were promised by God that they would enter into Canaan, the promised land, and eventually become rulers of it and serve God as a priestly nation. There are a few names, as I mentioned before, of God in the Torah, the first part of the Hebrew Bible. There's the ancient Hebrew word for God, which is just El. This was used also to refer to other gods, but because the ancient Jews only believed in one God, they could use it to refer not just to a God, but the God that they worshipped. There also was a more specific name given to that God, which is the tetragrammaton, or 4 letters, which is just the literal meaning of that word. The 4 letters are written in the Roman alphabet as YHWH, and their names in Hebrew are Yod, He, Vav, He. So this name is regarded by Jews as sacred and not to be said by anyone. Historically, it was only allowed to be said by the high priest of the Jews in the inner sanctum of the temple, the Holy of Holies it's called, and only once per year. So modern scholars reconstruct the pronunciation of this name as Yahweh. This is because ancient Hebrew didn't have any markers for vowels. There were only letters for the consonants, just like several other ancient alphabetic scripts. Later on, during the period of the rabbis, this is early Rabbinic Judaism, they developed diacritical marks that you could put around the letters or the consonants to indicate vowels and also for punctuation. So the Masoretic text is the name for the interpretation, you could say, or the version of the Hebrew Bible that's used in Rabbinic Judaism that has the vowels and punctuation added. And what's interesting is that because the name of God, the Tetragrammaton, is not ever supposed to be pronounced or uttered, they didn't put the vowels that were there in the original name. Rather, when you see the Tetragrammaton in the Hebrew script, you're supposed to say Adonai, which means Lord, i.e., a title or honorific given to God. So in the Hebrew Bible, in place of whatever the original vowels were of the Tetragrammaton, you see the vowels of the word Adonai. Also on the slide, you can see the Tetragrammaton written in 3 different scripts. I snagged this from Wikipedia, but it's a nice little infographic. On the top is the ancient Phoenician script. This is the ancestor of most of the world's alphabets, in fact, including the Hebrew alphabet, also the Roman alphabet and the Greek, but they went through more stages of transformation. You can see the ancient Phoenician alphabet, which is up top, is almost identical to that of ancient Hebrew, which is in the middle row. The language Phoenician was also related to Hebrew. They might have been partially mutually comprehensible. They probably were. So because these were peoples living right next to each other, basically, in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East. So Phoenicia was just north of the ancient kingdom of Israel. The Phoenicians were great traders. They had a lot of written records, so they developed the alphabet for their writing, and it spread to other places nearby. And then on the bottom row is how the Tetragrammaton is written in square Hebrew, as it's called. This is the version of the written Hebrew that's been used since the 3rd century BC up to the present. So this is basically the type of script that came to be used by the rabbis in Rabbinic Judaism. So as mentioned before, Jews believe in just one God. They're both monolatrous, only worshiping one God, but also monotheistic, believing there is only one true God. Jacob was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham, so he was the inheritor of the covenant between Abraham and God. Jacob came to also be called Israel, or father of the nation of Israel. According to the book of Genesis, he had 12 sons, and these were the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. The 12 tribes were basically different districts or regions that had different names, but they were the main constituents of the later ancient kingdom of Israel. So Joseph was a son of Jacob, but he was spurned by his older brothers. He was the younger son. So there's a long story there about their interactions. But basically, he fled to Egypt. His brothers tried to sell him into slavery, and he was abandoned, but he escaped, went to Egypt, and prospered there because, in part, he could interpret the dreams of the Pharaoh or the king of Egypt. Joseph was a visionary. So he was promoted by the Pharaoh. He was very wise, so the Pharaoh promoted him to be a chief minister, overseeing the farming, the taxes, and a lot of other stuff in his kingdom. So, basically, there was a famine that was coming. Joseph was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams that predicted the coming famine, and so he was able to set aside grain before the famine came so that Egypt could feed itself during the years of famine. During the famine, though, Joseph's relatives, his family, his fellow brothers, and his father and their wives and other relations came to Egypt because they had heard that there was still grain there. And eventually, Joseph met them. He kind of hid who he actually was, his identity first. His brothers just assumed he had been long since dead. But when they recognized him, there was a reconciliation. They forgave each other for their trespasses, so to speak. And Joseph was able to bring his father, his elderly father, and all of his brothers to Egypt, and they were able to prosper there. So their descendants in Egypt, the descendants of these 12 sons of Jacob, became the nation of Israel. And they prospered in Egypt for several centuries until a new dynasty of kings of Egypt came to power, and they ended up enslaving the Jews, or you could say the Israelites, the descendants of Jacob. Moses was the prophet who led the ancient Israelites to freedom from their slavery under the Egyptians. He was born from a Hebrew mother. The name Hebrew is actually more appropriate for referring to the Israelites or the Jews of this period. Strictly speaking, the word Jew refers to an inhabitant of Judah, which was just one part of the kingdom of Israel, one of the 12 tribes. And the word Israel could also be used for the descendants of Jacob or Israel that were living in Egypt at this time. But because the kingdom of Israel hadn't been established yet, there's also the name Hebrew, which was a word that could refer to nomads or wanderers. And apparently it was used by the Egyptians to refer to people like the ancient Israelites at this time. But in any event, the Hebrews, or the descendants of Jacob, were multiplying a lot in Egypt. One of the pharaohs regarded them as a potential threat, and so ordered newborn Hebrew boys to be put to death. Moses' mother wanted to save her newborn son Moses, so she put him on a raft of reeds and put him into the Nile River, where he was discovered coincidentally by the daughter of the pharaoh. So he was actually adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as an Egyptian. The name Moses is actually Egyptian, not Hebrew. But he was, in terms of his ancestry, a Hebrew or an Israelite. He also had an older brother named Aaron. So eventually Moses learned of his ancestry, started to identify with the sufferings of his fellow Hebrews or Israelites, and he ended up killing an Egyptian that was abusing a Hebrew. He had to go into exile to escape punishment. He went into the land of Midian, where he met a priest that introduced him to worship of God. He also had a vision of a burning bush, so an encounter with God. He took a wife. Eventually, he came back to help lead his people to freedom. At first, though, he didn't want to be a prophet because he had a lisp or wasn't a good public speaker. So he used his older brother Aaron as his mouthpiece, and he got God's permission to do that. So eventually, he went to the Pharaoh and asked Pharaoh to let the Hebrews go, let them go free, that they had to worship God in the desert and eventually, find the promised land of Canaan. But Pharaoh refused because he didn't want to give up all of these slaves or servants that he had. So because, as it says in the book of Exodus from the Torah, Pharaoh's heart was heavy or hard. This is actually kind of an interesting symbol in ancient Egyptian culture, because they believed that the dead were judged by having their heart placed on a scale. So I've heard people argue that when Exodus talks about the Pharaoh's heart being heavy or hard, it was because it was weighed down with sin. But anyway, Pharaoh refused to let the Hebrews go, and so God sent these 10 plagues upon the Egyptians of increasing severity. The last plague was the death of the firstborn male of every house of the Egyptians. And God also commanded Moses to tell the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and smear its blood on the doors of their homes, so that the angel of the Lord would pass over their homes and spare their firstborn men. This is the origin, at least according to Jewish tradition, of the Passover festival. And Passover today is celebrated to celebrate the freedom of the Israelites from Egypt and the establishment eventually of the kingdom of Israel. So after the 10th plague, Pharaoh finally relented and let the Hebrews go, although he later tried to raise an army and chase them, but this army was basically drowned in the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, depending on your interpretation of the scripture. The Jews were able to escape from Egypt. The waters of the sea went down. God caused a wind to blow so that they could walk through the watery area. And then when the Pharaoh tried to chase them with his army, they were drowned when the waters returned. So the book of Exodus describes the journey of the Hebrews from slavery in Egypt through the wilderness of the desert. That's also where Moses meets God on Mount Sinai and gets the revelation of the covenant between God and the Hebrews. Their journey from Egypt through the wilderness to the promised land of Canaan. So what were the revelations to Moses on Mount Sinai? Jews traditionally believe that the whole Torah, or the first 5 books of the Bible, called Toras Moshe in Hebrew, were revealed to Moses there, as well as both the written Torah and the oral Torah. The Mosaic covenant, the essence of it is that the Israelites, or the descendants of Jacob called Israel, are a chosen people who will follow God's commandments that were revealed specifically to Moses, enter the promised land of Canaan, and serve God as a priestly nation. Some of the revelation to Moses includes the Levites, or descendants of Levi, one of the sons of Jacob, to be the priestly tribe. So only Levites, or members of that tribe, were allowed to be priests that would officiate over the worship of God in the tabernacle, which is the sort of portable shrine to God that was specified as part of the Mosaic covenant. And the word in Hebrew for priest is Cohen. There are still modern Jews who have Cohen as their surname, and basically they're descended from the ancient priests who served in this way. So the tabernacle was the portable shrine used by the Israelites during their time in the wilderness, and also they used it for the first several generations after they went to Canaan. Historically speaking, the way it's laid out in the book of Exodus and other books in the Torah, it appears to be similar to war tents that were used by the pharaohs of Egypt. So it does show that there are some parallels between at least some of the practices of the ancient Jews and Egyptian religion, even though the theology was different. And finally, one of the instructions of God was to create an ark, or a wooden container that would hold the covenant, which contained stone tablets given by God to Moses that contained a written form of the law, or of this covenant. The tablets were placed into the ark, and the Ark of the Covenant was regarded as the most sacred object in ancient Judaism. And God's presence, or Shekinah, would be above the Ark of the Covenant in the inner sanctum, or the Holy of Holies, within the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was later moved to Jerusalem, and they eventually built the temple in Jerusalem, which basically replaced the tabernacle, but the same types of rituals and sacrifices were performed there later with the kingdom of Israel. So Moses died before the Hebrews reached the promised land of Canaan. Canaan at this time was ruled by other, mostly Semitic people, so they spoke languages similar to Hebrew. Canaanite and Hebrew at this time were probably either the same language or different dialects of the same language. There's a lot of overlap between the terminology, the writing, and even like names of gods and places, stuff like that, between the Canaanites and the ancient Israelites. So after Moses died, Joshua became their leader, and he actually led the Israelites into the land of Canaan. There was a long period known as that of the Judges. These were a kind of series of prophets inspired by God who gave guidance to the Israelites before they had a king to rule over them. One of the main rivals of the ancient Israelites were the Philistines. They ruled the area known as Philistia. You can see it there on the map in the southwest. So this was a coastal region, including the main cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. The Philistines were originally from across the sea. So they were one of the sea peoples that invaded that part of the Middle East during the late Bronze Age collapse. They had different customs from the Israelites. For example, they ate pigs, whereas eating pork was regarded as unclean and was against the Mosaic law that was revealed to the Jews on Mount Sinai. So there's a stark cultural, ritual, and linguistic difference between the Philistines and the ancient Israelites. But they had other rivals in the area as well. So eventually, Samuel was the last of the prophets and leaders inspired by God. And there was King Saul, the first king of Israel. But Samuel, one of his last actions before he died was to secretly anoint King David, who was chosen by God to be the king of the Israelites. So the early phase of the kingdom of Israel is known as the United Monarchy, or the United Kingdom, because it included all 12 of the tribes. And each tribe, at least in the later tradition, claimed descent from those 12 sons of Jacob. The capital of the United Kingdom, or United Monarchy, was Jerusalem. So that's where King David and Solomon ruled from. So Saul was the first king of Israel, but David, who is not his son, was chosen by God basically as his successor because he was favored by God. According to tradition, David is the author of the book of Psalms in the Tanakh. One of David's most famous feats is feeding Goliath, a giant champion of the Philistines. And David was regarded as an ideal ruler. He still had flaws. For example, he had an extramarital affair, but he was still beloved by God, as was David's son Solomon, who had a reputation for wisdom. So he built the first temple in Jerusalem, and this became the center of the worship of the God of the Israelites, Yahweh or El. A bit about the religion of the Canaanites. We know about this in part because of references from the Tanakh itself, because the Israelites at this time were worshiping a lot of the same gods as the Canaanites and some other surrounding peoples like the Phoenicians. These various Semitic peoples in the Near East had a lot of similarities in their culture, and the ancient Israelites were criticized by many prophets of God for their betraying God by worshiping other gods. So one of the gods of the Canaanite religion was El. This is also used as a name for the God of the Israelites in the Hebrew Bible. It could just mean God, though. There were also specific titles given to El, such as El Elyon, the Most High God, and El Shaddai, God of the mountain. Both of those were used for the God of the Israelites. But one of the main gods worshipped by the Canaanites that's criticized in the Bible is Baal. There was also Moloch and Asherah. Baal just means Lord, so it could refer to a title of several gods, but the main god called Baal was a god of storms and fertility. There was Moloch, whose name means king or ruler. It's probably related to the name Malachi, for example. He was a god of the Phoenicians, but one of the most distinctive practices connected to Moloch was child sacrifice. At least some people would sacrifice their firstborn child to Moloch, believing that it would give them success and prosperity later in life. And there appears to be actual archaeological evidence that this was done, including by the Carthaginians, who were settling in the western part of the Mediterranean in North Africa in the modern nation of Tunisia, but they were from Phoenicia originally. So the Phoenicians, because they were a great mercantile people, they spread all throughout the Mediterranean. There's even stories that they went as far as going around the southern end of Africa. They may have sailed all the way into northern Europe, etc. But they brought that worship of Moloch to other places too. And then one of the other gods that's named a lot and whose worship is criticized a lot in the Tanakh is Asherah, who is a fertility goddess traditionally regarded by the Canaanites as the wife of El, and she was associated with sacred trees or Asherah poles. So it might be a little bit weird that El is both being used as a name of the God of the Israelites, but also of this pagan or non-Israelite religion that is criticized in the Bible. Again, it's basically just because El means God, and so it could be used for the God that was traditionally regarded as king of the gods in the polytheistic Canaanite religion. But the Torah is quite clear that El, the God of Abraham, is actually the same as Yahweh, the God that reveals his name to Moses. So these gods are explicitly equated as being the one true God, and all other gods as being false gods in the revelation to Moses on Mount Sinai. There also were a bunch of high places or altars where various gods were worshipped with sacrificial offerings. And especially in the later history of the kingdom of Judah, some of the kings of Judah, such as Josiah, are portrayed as tearing down the high places and the Asherah poles so that they can try to end the worship of these other gods that is going against the covenant between God and the Israelites. So eventually, the kingdom of Israel is split in two. This is called the divided monarchy. There's a northern kingdom, also called Israel, because it included the majority of the tribes, and the southern kingdom called Judah. Judah, even though it was a bit smaller, it included the capital, Jerusalem, of the original United Monarchy and the temple there. And the reason why we have the name Jews for this people and this religion, it comes from the name of that southern kingdom, Judah, which survived a lot longer than the northern kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom had its capital at Samaria, and Samaria persisted later on, both as a town and as a region. And so that's partly why you still have this later people called Samaritans who practice kind of an alternate form of Judaism that had a different place of worship on a different mountain rather than in Jerusalem at the temple there. But in any event, the northern kingdom of Israel didn't last for very long. It was conquered by the rising kingdom of Assyria that was building an empire and conquering a lot of other parts of the Middle East. It was conquered around 720 BC. So at least some of the Israelites from the northern kingdom were forcibly expelled by the Assyrians. This was a common practice of a lot of empires, both in ancient times and even up to today, forced resettlements of conquered people to break their connection to their ancestral land and to make them less likely to be rebellious or politically problematic. So these are called the lost tribes of Israel because basically they're cut off from Judah, and they essentially over time appear to have mostly lost their identity as Israelites. Although, as I mentioned, some of them may have survived later on as the people known as the Samaritans, but they cease to be an independent kingdom or political entity. So the southern kingdom of Judah remained independent for several centuries. Some of the kings of Judah initiated various reforms. A lot of the reforms involved trying to end worship of other gods, return to what they regarded as the original purity of the covenant of Moses, the Mosaic covenant between God and Israel. The temple in Jerusalem became the center of sacrifice and worship in which all Jews were expected to go for at least 3 times a year during the pilgrimage festivals. There were periodic destructions of the Asherahs or the Asherah poles and the high places. A primary example of this is King Josiah, who ruled from around 640 to 609 BC. It's recorded in the Tanakh that a book of the law was discovered in the walls of the temple at this time. So this may have been the Deuteronomy or a copy of the Torah that had been buried and rediscovered. Some scholars regard this just as a fabrication, that maybe Josiah had some of his priests or scribes create this book for a new vision of what the religion of his people should be. Some scholars even claim that Judaism, as we know now, was kind of constructed during this time. That is possible. It is also possible that they really did find an old version of the Torah, because it was a custom of ancient people sometimes to bury sacred texts in the walls of temples. You can see other examples of that in other cultures and religions, for example. Regardless, the kingdom of Judah continued, and its kings, at least some of them, attempted to retain what they regarded as the purity of their religion, the purity of their culture, and the integrity of the Mosaic covenant. Eventually, however, the kingdom of Judah was also conquered by a foreign power, specifically the Babylonians. This happened in the year 586 BC under Nebuchadnezzar II, who was king of the so-called Neo-Babylonian Empire. So this led many Jews, especially the elite families and rulers, were forced into exile by the Babylonians, and most of them went to Babylon. Again, this was another kind of technique used by ancient emperors. If they conquered a people, even if they didn't force all of the conquered people to migrate, they would take all of the leading families, the nobles, the priests, the rulers, the ones who would be most likely to organize a rebellion against the conquerors, and they would move them to their capital or somewhere else where they could control them. So the Jewish priests and the main families became exiled into Babylon at this time, as well as just some other Jews as well. The Babylonian Jews regarded the temple in Jerusalem, however, as the only proper place of worship. They wanted to restore the temple in Jerusalem. They never gave up on that as their goal. And some Babylonian Jews would even visit Jerusalem to worship. So this is the beginning of the diaspora, or the dispersion of Jews outside of the kingdom of Judah, which only intensified after they were conquered later on by Greek and dynasties and Romans and others. So this is also the beginning of the houses of assembly, which are called Bete Knesset in Hebrew, or synagogues in Greek. Because the exiled Jews could not sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem as their law commanded, they used the synagogues as places for prayer, singing, chanting, teaching, and study of the Torah. So this is the origin historically of what later became the faction of the Pharisees and later still of Rabbinic Judaism. The scribes were the Jews whose role was to understand the Torah and to interpret it for the current situation of the Jews, like how to practice in exile since they couldn't actually perform the sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem. Eventually, the Babylonian Empire was itself defeated and conquered by a larger empire, that of the Persians. In particular, King Cyrus II the Great of Persia, or Kurash, as it would have been pronounced historically, conquered Babylon in 539 BC, and he essentially liberated the Jews there from captivity. He permitted them to return to Jerusalem if they wanted and to rebuild the temple, as is recorded in the book of Ezra, chapter 1, verse 3. So some of the Jewish families actually stayed in Babylon, and Babylon and that region became a later center of Judaism, but many of them did return to Jerusalem, and the city and the temple were reestablished under the leadership of some of the Jewish priests. However, Cyrus did not permit a restoration of the monarchy of Judah because he was still an emperor and wanted to be the sole ruler of all the lands he had conquered. So the leader of the priests who were reestablishing the temple worship in Jerusalem was Ezra, and he was assisted in this endeavor by Nehemiah, a Jewish official in the Persian government of the province of Judea, who helped rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. So Nehemiah, even though he was Jewish, he was working in the Persian government, but they were both cooperating with Ezra to reestablish the temple. So there's actually parts of the Tanakh that praise Cyrus the Great, even though he was a foreign ruler and conqueror, but because he permitted Ezra and Nehemiah to rebuild the temple. So in the land of Judah, there was actually a kind of strict separation between Jews or Judeans and non-Jews, because there were people of other ethnicities and religions living in the territory of the province of Judah. The Jews, they were distinct because they were circumcised, they worshipped on the Sabbath or Shabbat, as was called for in the Mosaic covenant, and they followed the sabbatical year, so a liturgical calendar that was distinct for them. They recognized the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses, and they made sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. And some also advocated that Jews should only marry other Jews, although there was some intermarriage in that time as well. So eventually the Persian Empire was conquered by Alexander the Great. He was a king of Macedon, but he was a conqueror of most of the Greek city-states. He was an admirer of and very influenced by Greek culture. A lot of the soldiers who fought in his army were Greek, and a lot of the people who came with him and traveled with the armies, like craftsmen and scholars, were Greek as well. So in the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, Alexander defeated the Persian Empire. There were cities founded by Greeks throughout the Middle East, as far east as northern or northwest India. Alexandria, Alexander the Great actually founded many cities named after himself, Alexandria, but the main one was in Egypt, and eventually it grew to become the leading city there and also had a Jewish population. But after Alexander the Great's death, he died as a relatively young man. His kingdom was divided up among his generals into several successor states, and there were different dynasties, all of them Greek-speaking. The Ptolemies, for example, ruled in Egypt. The Seleucids ruled in Syria, Mesopotamia, and Persia, and there was also a Macedonian dynasty. So even though Alexander's empire didn't outlast his death, there were other descendants of that empire that were Greek-speaking dynasties ruling large parts of the Middle East, including what previously had been the Kingdom of Judah. So during this period of the spreading of Greek language and Greek culture, many Jews became Hellenized. They may have learned to speak Greek. They may have even used Greek as their primary language. This happened in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, for example. Some of the Jews also started to adopt Greek customs and read Greek literature or texts. such as Plato or other Greek philosophy. The Hellenized Jews generally still visited Jerusalem to celebrate festivals at the temple. So some of them, many of them still remain Jewish in terms of their religion, but culturally they were more Greek. There were various kind of like degrees of Hellenization or assimilation to the mainstream Greek culture. A new Persian empire called the Parthian Empire arose in the 3rd century BC. They conquered Babylon and so ended the rule of the Greek dynasty there. And there was still a community of Jews in Babylon that had been there since the earlier exile. They became relatively cut off from the Jews in Jerusalem at this time. The Babylonian Jews spoke Aramaic, which was another Semitic language related to Hebrew, but it had been previously used as a kind of common tongue by a lot of peoples in the Middle East. And it was persisting through several different empires and dynasties that ruled there, just because once it had become established as the common language, it was useful for everyone to know it. But in the West, like in Judea, they mainly used Greek in the cities, not just Aramaic. So there was kind of like a growing cultural divide between the Babylonian Jews and the more Hellenized Jews who were in the West or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean. The high priest and other priests in Jerusalem tended to remain politically and economically powerful during this period. So they continued the priesthood and the hierarchy there under these various foreign dynasties. So a bit more about Judaism during this Hellenistic period. The synagogues became community and religious centers where many of the Jews would worship. So if they were not living near Jerusalem, they had to worship in a synagogue instead. So the synagogues also would give lodging to strangers or travelers, assistance to the poor. They would enforce discipline among their communities. They'd be a place of public gathering. They served as schools for children because people would learn to read Hebrew and study the Torah. And visiting preachers might give a sermon there as well. So the synagogues would always have a bet midrash or house of study. This was wherever the Bible was studied, the particular room or structure at the synagogue. And some of the Hellenized rabbis or teachers of the Torah would create rules for biblical interpretation. And this developed into later traditions of commentary and interpretation of the Torah. The picture on the slide is from a later synagogue called the Dura Europos synagogue. It shows Herod's temple. Herod was a later king of Judah, a client king under the Romans who helped refurbish the second temple. Philo of Alexandria was one of the most famous of the Hellenized Jews. He lived between 20 BC and 50 AD in Alexandria, Egypt. So he was a Jew who wrote in Greek. He explained the Bible or Tanakh of the Jews using principles from Greek philosophy. He was especially influenced by the philosophers Plato and the various Stoic philosophers. He presented events from Israel's history as allegories or symbolic narratives of eternal truths. He also talked about the Logos, which is the Greek word for word or reason, as a second God between God and the world. In the long run, he had a larger influence on Christianity than on Rabbinic Judaism. So eventually the Romans defeated King Antiochus III of Syria in 191 to 190 BC. So Antiochus was one of the Greek kings and one of those Greek dynasties that were successor states basically to Alexander the Great. Some Jews ended up settling in Antioch, Syria, and in Asia Minor, and probably in Rome too after this time. So the diaspora, in other words, was continuing over larger areas. The Romans exacted tribute from Antiochus, leading to increased taxes on the people in his realm. And this caused tensions between the rich and poor in Jerusalem and Judah, and between the Hellenized and non-Hellenized Jews. Then there was a king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled from 175 to 164 BC. He was attempting to nominate his own cronies, basically, or favorites, to the high priesthood of the Jews, and many Jews resisted his nominee. Antiochus then sent troops to sack Jerusalem. He attacked the Jewish religion, and he established pagan practices in the Holy of Holies, or inner sanctum of the temple. This is referred to in the Tanakh as the abomination of desolation because it's basically a desecration or a corrupting of the holiest place in the religion. Antiochus was Greek, so he had Greek gods like Zeus worshipped there, including with sacrifice of pigs or unclean animals. So some Jews ended up submitting to his rule. Others, called Hasidim or the pious, adhered to the Torah, and they suffered greatly. Eventually, some of the Jews revolted against the Syrian kings. This is known as the Revolt of the Maccabees. It was led by the Maccabee family, the head of whom was Judas Maccabeus. And he actually had some military victories against this Syrian dynasty. They're called Syrian, but they were actually ethnically Greek. Their center, their capital was in Syria, so just north of Judah, basically, on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. So eventually, even though Judah remained within the empire of these Greek Syrian kings, they were able to get a favorable treaty with the Syrians, and Judas Maccabeus was able to capture Jerusalem and cleanse the desecrated temple. This is actually basis for the later Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah, also called the Festival of the Dedication, because they were able to purify and rededicate the temple to God. And Judas Maccabeus and his descendants were permitted to rule the province of Judah or Judea, even though they were technically under the authority of these foreign kings still. So this period is known as the Hasmonean Kingdom. It was a quasi or somewhat autonomous kingdom of Jews founded by the Maccabees. However, many of the Hasmonean kings themselves were Hellenized, or they had adopted a lot of Greek culture. And so the more pious or traditional Jews still regarded some of them as a corrupting influence. Eventually, Judea became a vassal of the expanding Roman Empire. They were formally conquered in 63 BC under the Roman ruler Pompey. And the king of the Hasmonean dynasty was confirmed by the Romans as Judea's ruler and high priest, but was stripped of the title king, or basileus in Greek. Even though the Romans spoke Latin, Greek was still used as the language of law and administration in the Eastern Mediterranean. So basically, the Hasmoneans were made into governors or client kings under the Romans, who would rule on behalf of Rome, collect tribute, and send it to the Romans. This led to the reign of Herod the Great, who lived between 73 and 4 BC. In 40 BC, he ascended to rule over the province of Judea. He was given the title King of the Jews by the Romans. He was a very Hellenized Jew. His personal life was somewhat scandalous, but the province of Judea prospered under his rule. He built several cities, including Sebaste and Caesarea, a port on the sea, several powerful fortresses, including Masada and Herodium, palaces, theaters, and amphitheaters. He also rebuilt or refurbished the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Second Temple, by the way, I forgot to mention this earlier, is what we call the temple after it was reestablished by Ezra and Nehemiah after the Babylonian captivity. Herod, even though he was a somewhat successful client king of the Romans, he was hated by many of the Jews who opposed Rome and Hellenism, or assimilating into these Greek or foreign customs. So many Jews expected the Messiah to come soon, like in the 1st or 2nd century AD. This Messiah or anointed king was prophesied by the prophets of the Tanakh. They expected him to restore the kingdom of Israel. They expected him to be a descendant of King David, who would defeat the Romans and create basically a new period of peace, freedom, and a golden age for the Jews. The Christians started out as a sect of Jews who believed that their leader, Jesus of Nazareth, who lived from around 4 BC to 30 AD, was the Messiah. Even though Christianity started out as primarily a Jewish sect, many Jews rejected the sect, and at some point, most of their followers were from Gentiles or non-Jews, including many Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, and others. They just started spreading throughout the Middle East and Mediterranean. Most Jews, though, did not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah, in part because Jesus died on the cross. He was crucified, and Jews were expecting a Messiah who would be a powerful leader who would help reestablish the kingdom of Israel, restore the worship, or sorry, give independence to Jerusalem so that they could practice their temple worship without foreign influence. And that just didn't happen with Jesus of Nazareth. So eventually, Emperor Caligula, a Roman emperor who ruled from 37 to 41 AD, demanded that all of his subjects throughout the empire worship him as a god. This custom had kind of started in the Greco-Roman world around the time of Alexander the Great. It was based on a more ancient Persian custom where some of the Persian emperors and other ancient Middle Eastern rulers claimed to have the status of gods. And it was sort of taken by the Romans, though, as a political loyalty test, that they wanted their subjects to worship them as gods, some of the living emperors or the deceased emperors, to show that they were loyal to the Roman regime. And this was not a problem really for a lot of peoples at the time because they were polytheistic. They were accustomed to worshiping a large variety of gods and goddesses. So kind of adding one to the list was maybe not such a big deal. But it was a big deal for the Jews because they were strict monotheists and they regarded it as a violation of their covenant with God to worship the emperor or any other god. So this was taken very badly by a lot of Jews, some of whom ended up revolting against the Romans. Caligula even went so far as to order a statue of himself depicted as Zeus, the king of the Greek gods, to be placed inside the temple in Jerusalem, which was a major affront and an abomination or a desecration of the temple, as it would have been regarded by the ancient Jews. So these actions by Caligula and other Roman emperors led to Jewish revolts. There were a series of revolts in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. There was a period of constant conflict between Greeks and Jews in the coastal cities in and near Judea. They eventually revolted against Rome in 66 AD. Initially, their revolt was successful, but Rome eventually gathered together a very large force, sacked the city of Jerusalem, and utterly destroyed the temple in 70 AD, looting it. You can see the picture on the slide is treasures from the temple, including the menorah or candelabrum that held the lamps that was part of the sacred liturgy of God in the temple, spelled out by the Mosaic covenant. Those sacred objects were plundered by the Romans and taken back to Rome, as depicted on Trajan's column. And they really destroyed the temple, actually cast down most of the stones, stripped it down to the foundation. So as a consequence, Jews lost the temple, their priesthood, and the Sanhedrin, or the priestly council. Jerusalem ceased to be the center of Judaism. The priesthood and the sacrifices at the temple ceased to be the heart of the religion. So this eventually set the stage for its transformation into Rabbinic Judaism. The Romans utterly destroyed Jerusalem after the 1st century AD Jewish revolt, and they built a new city, Aelia Capitolina, near the ruins of the old. The old city of modern Jerusalem, as it's called today, descends actually from this Roman rebuilding, what used to be called Aelia Capitolina. There was also another revolt against the Romans in the 2nd century AD. So this was led by Bar Kokhba. That was a name given to Simon or Shimon Bar Kokhba. He was also called Simon Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star. So he claimed to be the Messiah, and he was actually supported by one of the main rabbis at the time, Rabbi Akiva ben Joseph, who lived from 40 to 137 AD. He was the greatest rabbinic scholar of the day and had a big impact on later rabbinic Judaism. Historically speaking, the actual building of Aelia Capitolina may have instigated the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba in 132 AD. So the Romans eventually defeated this uprising, and that was kind of it in terms of ancient Jewish rebellions against the Romans, and also kind of the end of ancient Jewish expectations of the Messiah for the most part. There had been a lot of predictions, apparently based on dating schemes connected to prophecies in the book of Daniel. So a lot of ancient Jews expected the Messiah to come in the 1st century AD or sometime shortly thereafter. And so after the Bar Kokhba revolt was crushed, there were some interpretations that the period of the Messiah that in prophecy was over, or at the very least, people ceased to be hopeful that the Jews would regain their independence under a Messiah. The Romans also were very harsh in their treatment of the Jews in Judea after the series of revolts. They renamed the province Palestine. This was, or actually it was Syria Palestine, but this was intended as an insult against the Jews because the Roman word Palestine came from the Philistines, which were the ancient enemy of the Jews. By this time, the Philistines didn't even exist anymore as a distinct people or ethnic group, so the Romans chose that name just as a direct insult to the Jews still living in the area. Jews were also forbidden from entering the city of Aelia Capitolina that had been rebuilt essentially on the ruins of Jerusalem. And there were even more laws that were harsh towards Jews. It was forbidden for converts to Judaism to become circumcised, and thus they couldn't actually become fully participating members in the religion. The region of Galilee to the north of Jerusalem became the new center of Jewish life in the overall area or region. And there were several different towns in succession that became the seat of the Jewish council. But eventually, the authority of the Sanhedrin was taken over by later schools of rabbis. Now we're going to talk about the history of Rabbinic Judaism, which begins after the period of the destruction of the Second Temple. Rabbinic Judaism has its origin in the ancient sect or faction of the Pharisees. They emphasized Torah study and interpretation and observing the commandments rather than temple sacrifices or rituals. Unlike the Sadducees or the priestly class, the Pharisees included the prophets and the writings in their scriptures, not just the Torah. An early leader of Rabbinic Judaism was Yohanan ben Zakkai, who lived from 30 to 90 AD. He founded a school of rabbis in Yamnia or Yavne in Galilee, so this is north of Jerusalem. The title rabbi or master became commonly used in this period as a title for teachers, hence the name Rabbinic Judaism. Yohanan ben Zakkai also fixed the liturgical calendar or the ritual calendar used throughout the year for Jews who were living outside of Judea. Previously, this had been the prerogative of the high priest of the temple in Jerusalem. So you can see Yohanan ben Zakkai and his school of rabbis taking over functions that previously had been done by the Levites, by the Cohens or priests, and kind of regulated by the Sanhedrin or priestly council. Gamaliel the elder was a teacher in the 1st century AD as well. He was the successor to Yohanan ben Zakkai and also a member of the Pharisee faction or party. So a bit more about the school at Yamnia that was founded by Yohanan ben Zakkai. It ended up serving the function of the new council or Sanhedrin of the Jews after the old one was essentially dissolved after the Romans destroyed the temple in the 1st century AD. However, this new council that was created by the rabbis at Yamnia adopted the name Sanhedrin or Great Sanhedrin. Jews throughout the Roman world and elsewhere continued to look to this new Sanhedrin for advice and judgments. They would basically regulate the ritual calendar and observances. There's also the word Tanaim or teachers, which is a collective name for the various rabbis of this early period of Rabbinic Judaism. One of the early texts that was created is called the Pirkei Avot, which could be translated as Ethics of the Fathers. It includes various sayings of the Tanaim. Eventually, there were new authorities and structures created, generally in other schools or academies controlled by rabbis. Simeon ben Gamaliel II was an authority of the 2nd century AD. He himself was the son of Gamaliel II, who was the first Nazi, which means prince or president, of the Great Sanhedrin after the destruction of the Second Temple. And Simeon ben Gamaliel II also in turn became Nazi of the Sanhedrin and the first Palestinian patriarch. So the patriarch title reflects the fact that he was given authority over all Jews in the Roman Empire, at least ostensibly. So the Romans, in other words, eventually acknowledged some Jews as successors in terms of religious authority after they had destroyed the more ancient temple hierarchy. Judah I, called the Prince, was born in 135 AD. So these were all people living in the 2nd century AD. He was the son of Simeon ben Gamaliel II. He was also known as Rabbi HaKadosh. So Judah I, the Prince, was a noted scholar, and he ended up having considerable influence on early Rabbinic Judaism. During this period, the Mishnah was codified and published or widely circulated. Mishnah is the Hebrew written versions of the Jewish oral traditions. In fact, historically speaking, it was composed during this period by the Tanaim, or the chief rabbinic scholars. But according to Jewish tradition, it goes back to the time of Moses. It was an oral teaching, not originally codified and written down, but that was passed down through the generations and then attained written form during this period, so roughly the 2nd century AD. Eventually, the Palestinian Patriarchate, though, came to an end. Gamaliel VI, who was the last patriarch, was executed by the Romans in the year 425. So this ended the Palestinian Patriarchate, and the Great Sanhedrin was permanently dissolved. It was never reconstituted, even in a new form under the rabbis. Eventually, the Roman Empire ended up largely converting to Christianity. Constantine the Great, the Roman emperor in the early 4th century AD, converted in 313. As Christianity began to expand in the empire, including in the government hierarchy, that led to increased tensions between Jews and Christians, because Christians regarded Jews as heretical for not accepting Jesus as the Jewish Messiah. Jews, for their part, regarded Christians as heretical or even blasphemous for calling a human being who was actually a false prophet both Messiah and Son of God. However, despite the growing tensions between Jews and Christians, and despite the fact that the Jewish revolts in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD had previously been crushed by the Roman Empire, there was some recovery of the Jewish community in Egypt. However, the Jewish community in Egypt and in Palestine, they never really reached the heights they had had by the 1st century AD. There was kind of like a permanent decline of Judaism in that part of the Middle East or the Mediterranean. There were still some Jews in Palestine and Egypt, but they didn't have the same numbers and the same kind of like intellectual significance. A lot of the Jews spread to other parts of the Roman Empire in the Middle East, such as the city of Babylon, which had never gone away, but there was a Jewish community there that retained a lot of intellectual prominence. Eventually, this was like in the 3rd, but especially in the 4th century AD and after, or really by the 4th century AD and after, Greek culture started to decline. There had been kind of like a long run of Greek culture and language on the rise. It didn't like just go away or end, but the first period of it spreading outside of Greece significantly was during the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC, when he conquered much of the known world. And so from the 4th century BC to the 4th century AD, there were a lot of Greek-speaking cities. A lot of philosophy was written in Greek. A lot of other literature was used in government in a lot of the eastern half of the Roman Empire. Initially, they mainly used Latin, at least the actual imperial officials, but over time in the Eastern Roman Empire, they started just adopting Greek. But this Greek influence over the Jews and just other cultures in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean really started to decline in the 4th century AD, and especially went down a lot after the Muslim conquest in the 7th century AD. So a bit more about the historical background during this late Roman period. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD. The date 476 AD is often given as the end of the Roman Empire in the West. It's somewhat artificial because it's based on the deposition of the last titular Western Roman emperor. But even before that date, Germanic kings had largely taken over in the West. However, the Roman Empire did continue strong in the eastern half of the Mediterranean. So we're talking about the modern nations of Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria, Turkey, Syria, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, parts of Libya, other parts of the former Yugoslav republics like Serbia, Croatia. A lot of those were all parts of the Eastern Roman Empire. So they just consider themselves successors to the Roman Empire. Their capital was in Constantinople, which had been founded by Emperor Constantine as his great imperial capital in the East. But in part because of religious differences, the Eastern Romans, who were Christian, ruled the Jews in Palestine harshly. In fact, the Jews there sought to aid invading Persian forces when the Persian Empire invaded the Eastern Roman Empire in the year 614. There were a series of military conflicts between the Eastern Romans and the Persians. They eventually exhausted themselves so much through the fighting. This is one of the reasons why the Muslim armies, when they came later in the 7th century AD, were able to conquer the entire Persian Empire and large parts of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Jews in Jerusalem also rebelled against the Roman emperors in the year 617, but they were defeated by the Romans at that time. There was, however, another expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem then. There were also a bunch of Jews in the Persian or Sassanid Empire. This was a different dynasty than the earlier Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, for example, who were the ones that had come into conflict with the Greek city-states and which were eventually conquered by Alexander the Great. This was a new Persian dynasty, though, that created a large empire of their own. So there was a title given for the Jews living in Babylon, which was controlled by the Sassanids. The title was Exilarch, or leader, arche in Greek, of the exiles, the Jews that had been there since essentially the Babylonian exile, which had happened many centuries before under the Babylonian Empire. Some of the Jews had just never gone back to Jerusalem. The exilarch was recognized by the government of Babylon, which was part of the Persian Empire then, as having authority over the Jews in that city. However, relations between the Jews in Babylon and the Persian authorities eventually became difficult, such that by the time the Arab Muslim armies arrived in the 7th century, they were largely welcomed by the Babylonian Jews. In turn, after the Arab Muslims conquered the Persian Empire, including Babylon, the Muslim rulers recognized the Jewish exilarch in Babylon as having authority over the Jews in that city. That was often a custom of these pre-modern empires. They would have deputies or delegates ruling the different ethnic groups or religious groups in their domain. That would be kind of like intermediaries between the various peoples and the imperial hierarchy. So a bit more about the spread of Islam and how Judaism fared under Muslim rule. Islam was a monotheistic religion that started in Arabia in the 7th century AD by the Prophet Muhammad. It was monotheistic and had some beliefs in common with Jews and Christians. However, unlike Jews, Muslims or followers of Muhammad do recognize Jesus as a prophet, and they recognize Muhammad as the last and greatest of the prophets. They have other differences too, such as insisting that God's covenant with Abraham was inherited by his son Ishmael, who became ancestor of the Arabs, rather than by Isaac. And Muslims also believe that the Jewish scriptures, like those of Christianity, became corrupted at some point, and so Muslims view their revealed scripture, the Quran, as having priority. So Islam spread rapidly out of Arabia in the 7th to 8th centuries. Muslim armies quickly defeated the Eastern Romans in the year 634 and conquered Syria and Palestine. They also invaded the Persian Empire in the year 637 and were able to subjugate basically the entire empire in fairly short order. They then invaded Egypt, which previously had been a province of the Eastern Roman Empire, and northern Africa. Eventually, they reached all the way to Spain, which they invaded in the year 711 and took over Spain. They also invaded France, but were defeated by a Frankish army in the 700s and didn't make further progress into Western Europe after that. So Muslims, they basically gave a kind of toleration to Jews, Christians, and other monotheists under their rule. People who were monotheistic were allowed to keep their religion, but they were given a special status under the law called zimmi. They had to pay a larger tax than Muslims. So because zimmis actually paid a higher tax, there was even a financial incentive for some Muslim rulers to not encourage or force too many of them or all of them to convert to Islam. Nevertheless, there was a gradual conversion of the population subject to the Muslim caliphs or rulers to Islam over the course of the century. So, for example, when Egypt was conquered by the Muslims, they were majority Christian, but over time they became majority Muslim with a Christian minority. So eventually, in the first couple of centuries of the Muslim caliphates or dynasties, there was a golden age of scholarship. A lot of older works that had been written in Greek, even in Persian, Chinese, and Indian languages were translated into Arabic. Also worth mentioning is Syriac texts. There was a lot of early Christian theology in Syriac that got translated into Arabic. So there were Arab scholars writing responses, commentaries, interpretations, and their own novel theories related to mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, chemistry, medicine, and philology. An example is the algebra that comes from an Arabic word that was developed during this time. There were also Jewish scholars who participated in this work. A lot of the Jewish scholars were multilingual. They would learn Arabic as well as knowing Hebrew and a variety of other languages. So one example of a prominent Jewish scholar during the early Islamic age is Saadia Gaon, who lived from 882 to 942. He lived during the Abbasid Caliphate, which is technically the third of the Muslim caliphates. And he integrated Greek philosophy, especially that of Aristotle, with Rabbinic Judaism. He disagreed with Aristotle in several ways. In this respect, he was somewhat similar to the Kalam school of Muslim philosophy that had also developed during this time. But his main goal was creating a kind of synthesis, a partial critique of Aristotelian and other Greek philosophy, but mainly synthesizing and systematizing Greek philosophical theories and concepts with Rabbinic Judaism, and defending Rabbinic Judaism while critiquing Karaite Judaism. So Rabbinic Judaism included, for example, the authority, the teachings, and traditions of the rabbis of the various academies that produced the Mishnah and then the later Midrash and commentaries that got put together into the Talmud. And Saadia Gaon was defending this against Karaite Judaism, which didn't have the Talmud or the Mishnah. His most famous work is the Book of Beliefs and Opinions, which was created in 933. And that was kind of like his attempt to systematically explicate and defend Rabbinic Jewish theology. So I mentioned this word Mishnah a few times. This is a kind of commentary or oral tradition on the original Tanakh. The Mishnah was written down starting in the 2nd century AD. It was largely developed in its final form by around 200 AD. The Mishnah collections were of various tractates that consist of halachot, or observances. So these were authored, historically speaking, by the Tanaim, the early leaders of Rabbinic Judaism. The halachot are derived from the commandments of the books of Moses in the Torah, but they can be more detailed. The goal is to have them cover every area of daily life and of ritual purity. So the first tractate of the Mishnah is called the Pirkei Avot, or Sayings of the Fathers, or Ethics of the Fathers, and it begins with a few general principles for interpretation of the Torah and practice of Judaism. For example, verse 1 of the Pirkei Avot says, quote, Moses received Torah from Sinai and passed it on to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets passed it on to the men of the great assembly, i.e. the Sanhedrin. They said 3 things: be careful in giving judgment, raise up many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah, end quote. That notion of the fence around the Torah is significant. So basically there is a historical trend or tendency to make more and more strict observances to avoid accidentally or unintentionally, or at least partially, violating a commandment of the Torah. The main example I usually think of that is how the dietary observances of Jews have gotten more strict since the way they appear, at least in a literal interpretation, in the Torah. So for example, in the Torah it says to not boil the kid or the baby lamb in its mother's milk. And that gets interpreted as not only not cooking meat in milk, but having no contact at all between meat and any dairy product in any stage of food preparation or even consumption, to the extent that a lot of modern Orthodox Jews will have separate sets of utensils or even separate kitchens to handle dairy-containing foods versus meat-containing foods. And you can see that gradual process of development and kind of like intensification of these fences around the Torah, starting with the Mishnah. So Rabbinic Jews regard following the Mishnah as necessary for following the Torah itself, and they believe that guarding the Torah will ensure that it guards you. The Gaons were the heads of the academies, the rabbinic academies in Babylon, and their authority over Jews in general grew, especially after around 600 AD. Their authority ensured that the Babylonian Talmud, that was the collection of their midrash or their commentaries, became widely accepted by Jews in general. In addition, there was a Gaonate of Palestine, which was established a bit later than that of Babylon. It was established in the 9th century AD, and it was mainly recognized as authoritative by Jews then living in Spain, Egypt, and Italy. So during this age of the Gaons, both those of Palestine and of Babylon, there were new forms of rabbinic Jewish literature. The Masoretic text of the Bible was fixed and annotated, including adding the vowels and punctuation. There were various collections of Talmudic observances and commentaries that were eventually collected. New forms of literature like poetry to be read in synagogue, prayer books were compiled. There was also a type of literature called responsa. That's the Latin term, but in Hebrew, she'elot ve'teshuvot, question and answer. So questions on how to practice or how to apply the observances would be submitted to the Gaons. They would be debated in the academies, and then answers would be sent in the names of the Gaons. This is still an important part of Rabbinic Judaism today. So Talmud means teaching, but this is a type of text or literature with collections of writings containing rabbis' teachings from across the diaspora or communities of Jews in different parts of the world about the meaning and implementation of the Tanakh and the Mishnah. So it consists of rabbis' midrash or commentary on the Tanakh or Bible and the Mishnah or oral Torah. So there were two main Talmudic collections, the Palestinian or Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The Palestinian Talmud is a record of the discussion of the rabbinic schools of Galilee, especially of Tiberias, starting in the 4th century AD, and it was used a lot by Jews in Italy and in Egypt. The Babylonian Talmud was authored by several Babylonian academies from around 200 to 650 AD, and it was compiled together in its current form in the 7th to 8th centuries AD. It contains the opinions of more than 1,000 rabbis. It's very long, around 4 million words, which is even longer than the Jerusalem Talmud, and that was the main Talmudic collection used by Jews living in the Muslim Caliphate. It's also become the most commonly used version of the Talmud today. So the Talmud contains different kinds of writings and most notably a diversity of views. Different rabbis could give different rulings, and a lot of times the disagreements aren't resolved, they're just presented as such. But they are very comprehensive. They cover all areas of life, and they're concerned with the process of answering questions and with the questions themselves. So an example of a kind of new doctrine or a newly added development of a doctrine that occurred under Rabbinic Judaism was the understanding of a Shekinah or divine presence. So the Shekinah could refer to, in general, the indwelling presence of God in the creation. Previously, the notion was more that God's presence was in the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, in the temple in Jerusalem, above the Ark of the Covenant. But later on in the Rabbinic period, there is a more general idea of the indwelling presence of God in the world. So, for example, the Midrash, this is paraphrasing the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verse 25. It says, quote, "The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you," unquote. And, quote, "may he give thee of the light of the Shekinah," unquote. So this is basically a way of illustrating the idea that people can interact with the Shekinah or presence of God kind of in the world. They don't have to wait, until after death, for example. Saadia Gaon had said that the Shekinah is identical with the glory of God and serves as an intermediary between God and humans. So it almost appears that Shekinah is a kind of emanation or a creation or an aspect of God that's different from God proper, but there are different interpretations of this. Judah Halevi of Toledo, in his Kuzari, said that it's the Shekinah rather than God himself who appears to the prophets. The Shekinah is sometimes described or conceived of as feminine. The picture on the slide, the pillar of cloud and flame, that was something that goes back to the Torah, the book of Exodus. That was how God appeared when he was leading the Jews out of Egypt to the promised land. But it's one possible way of conceiving of the divine presence of God in the world, especially when it's made manifest to the senses. Karaite Judaism is another form of Judaism distinct from Rabbinic Judaism. It was founded by Anan ben David, who lived from 715 to 795. Its main doctrines is that it rejects the Talmud and the Mishnah. So it only regards the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible as authoritative. They, in other words, reject the authority and traditions of the various rabbinical academies. Karaite Judaism does survive today, but only in relatively small numbers. The vast majority of Jews around the world ended up following Rabbinic Judaism. A bit more about the development of scholarship among the various Jews living in exile. This slide focuses on Spanish Jewish scholars and philosophers. Spain was ruled by a Muslim caliphate, but Jews rose to influential positions at the court in Spain. Jews were often multilingual and literate, so they were useful as officials and translators. Spanish Jews are called Sephardim or Sephardic Jews from the Hebrew name for Spain. They spoke a dialect of Spanish known as Ladino. An example of a famous Spanish Jewish scholar was Solomon ibn Gabirol, who lived from 1021 to 1058. He attempted to reconcile Judaism with Neoplatonic philosophy. Neoplatonism or late Platonism was a development of Platonism based on the philosophy of Plato, who had lived in the 5th to 4th centuries BC, but it was mainly developed in the 3rd century AD and after, so in the Roman Empire period. So it was a later form of Platonism, but it had a big influence not only on Jewish philosophy and theology, but also of that of Christianity and Islam. A lot of those religions produced theologians and philosophers that they disagreed on things, but they largely were coming from this Platonist and partially Aristotelian paradigm based on the philosophy of Aristotle. Partly the influence of Aristotle was actually mediated by the Neoplatonism, because the later Platonists, like Plotinus and his followers, Plotinus was the one who founded Neoplatonism or late Platonism, but they often tried to reconcile Aristotle with Plato. Solomon ibn Gabirol influenced Kabbalah, or the later Jewish mystical tradition. So Neoplatonism, one of its doctrines is that there's a first principle of being and becoming called the One. And Neoplatonists tend to think of everything else that exists as emanating in a hierarchy of degrees of being and of metaphysical dependence from this one being. So the one of Neoplatonism became identified with the God of Judaism in the philosophy of Solomon ibn Gabirol. And there was a similar move done by other Neoplatonist influenced monotheistic theologians and philosophers from this period, although they had, for example, different theories about the nature of the Godhead and just about, you could say, their overall metaphysical understanding of God, or indeed of the process of emanation itself. The pagan Neoplatonists tended to subordinate these lesser divine aspects, such as the logos or the intellect and the world soul, as being creations in a sense, or metaphysical emanations of the One. In the Christian Trinitarian version of Neoplatonism, they modified that. And so too with the Jewish versions of Neoplatonism, there would have been differences from the Neo-pagan, the pagan Neoplatonist. But there was still a strong influence there on the underlying metaphysics or theory of being, and how all of creation, or you could say causally dependent being, relates to the One, or God. Judah Halevi of Toledo, who lived from 1085 to 1140, authored a fictional dialogue between a Jewish scholar and the king of the Khazars. The Khazars were a Turkish tribe from Central Asia who converted to Judaism. In this dialogue, it's argued that philosophy could prove God's existence, but that revelation was necessary to know more about him. That was a very common view also among Christian philosophers of the period, that a certain amount of truths about God, such as his existence and some of his nature or essence, could be proven through reason or philosophy, but that revelation through scripture had to be used to get other information. So a bit more about the fate and status of Jews in Western Europe in the early medieval period. Starting in the mid-11th century and after, the Western Jewish scholars, like of Spain and elsewhere, became more important for Jews living in Western Europe than the Gaons of Babylon or Palestine. And there was also a gradual shift from the philosophical influence of Plato and Neoplatonism to that of Aristotle. You can see this in the philosophy of Rashi, or Rabbi Solomon ben Isaac, also known as Shlomo Yitzhaki, who lived from 1040 to 1105. He was a Jewish scholar from France. He produced the standard commentaries on the Bible and the Talmud that were used by Western Jews. His commentaries, in fact, are still printed in the Talmud, together with various editions by his successors. This fact that the Talmud, which itself started as commentary, it later developed commentaries of its own, shows you the iterative process within Rabbinic Judaism of adding many layers of commentary on the Tanakh, but also just on the observances and the early rulings of the rabbis. So there was a debate about whether Aristotle's philosophy could be reconciled with Judaism and other biblical religions. Moses Maimonides, or Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, probably one of the most famous Jewish philosophers of all time, lived from 1135 and to 1204. He actually wrote a code containing all of the halachot, or observances, in his Mishneh Torah, which is still a very influential text among Jews. He was exiled from Spain to Egypt. He wrote the Guide for the Perplexed in Arabic. This discussed difficulties of Aristotle's philosophy for monotheistic believers of Judaism, but potentially of other monotheistic Abrahamic religions too. So Moses Maimonides was trying to reconcile Aristotle's philosophy with his Jewish religion. He emphasized as well orthodoxy, or right belief, not just orthopraxy, or right behavior. So he thought it wasn't just important that you followed all of the commandments and observances, but that you also had the right theology and philosophy. He authored 13 Principles of the Faith, which served as 13 roots, you could say, of Judaism. And he emphasized the unity and the oneness of God, showing the continuing influence of Neoplatonism in this regard, although it's fair to say that this is also based on Aristotle's understanding of God as well, or as Aristotle would call him, the first mover, or the unmoved mover. As Jews spread throughout Europe, it started in Italy and Spain and southern France. This was basically the parts of the Western Mediterranean that were ruled by the Roman Empire. But after the collapse of the Roman Empire and into the Middle Ages, they continued to spread to other parts of Central, Northern, and Eastern Europe. There was periodic persecution of the Jews in the various Christian kingdoms. This also happened in some of the Muslim dynasties, even though there was an official protected status of zimmi for Jews and Christians. But it happened just as often, if not more often, in the various Christian kingdoms of Europe. So one example of this actually was the Crusades. The Crusades were initially called by the Pope in the Middle Ages to try to take back the Holy Land, especially around Jerusalem, from the Muslims and protect Christian pilgrims going there. But they ended up leading to a lot of chaos and violence and crimes against a variety of people. Among others, the Crusaders looted and slaughtered some Jews on their way to the Holy Land. When they conquered Jerusalem, they killed a lot of people there, actually Jews, Muslims, and Christians. There was just a lot of slaughter, regrettably. But some Jews regarded such death as martyrdom, or as Kiddush Hashem, which means sanctification of the name. And there are even accounts of Jews who committed suicide rather than renouncing their faith when threatened by violence by the Crusaders. There was also a lingering problem throughout the Middle Ages and after of blood libel. Christians claimed sometimes that Jews were guilty of ritual murder or of using the blood of Christian children during the Passover. As far as anyone is aware, this was totally just a concocted lie, but it led to periodic persecutions of the Jews. So you can see from the map expulsion of Jews from various countries and the dates of the expulsions. This was a kind of sporadic thing. Jews were alternatively welcomed for their contribution to the economy and their various types of expertise. They often practiced a lot of trades and they were literate, but then people would get riled up against them and rulers or populations would attack them. Another example of a widespread falsehood told about the Jews starting in the Middle Ages is the libel of the desecration of the host. Some Christians claim that Jews stole consecrated bread of the Eucharist and stabbed or burned it. Again, like the blood libel, this is probably just a mythical fabrication. Ironically, similar fabrications had been made against the Christians by the ancient Romans to justify their persecutions of the Christians. So some of the major expulsions and persecutions of Jews. Jews arrived in England in the 11th century. They were expelled in the year 1290 and didn't return in significant numbers until after 1650, with the Jews returning then actually largely coming from the Netherlands and Amsterdam, where previously they had traveled to the Netherlands after being expelled from Portugal earlier. In southern Italy, in 1290 to 1293, there were many Jewish communities that were destroyed and some forced conversions to Christianity. In France, Jews were expelled in the year 1306, and there were massacres of Jews as well in the year 1348. And then Jews were falsely accused of poisoning wells and of causing the Black Death or the bubonic plague in the year 1348. One of the biggest expulsions of the Jews was from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497. A lot of the Jews that were expelled from Portugal ended up settling in the Netherlands, where they became important in terms of finance and commerce. Some of them later migrated to England. There was a new genre of Jewish literature called Kabbalah that developed starting in the late Middle Ages. Kabbalah is an example of mysticism. You can define mysticism, especially as it relates to Kabbalah, as a way of experiencing things other than through ordinary sense perception or intellect, including direct vision of divine things. There was also a more ancient Jewish mystical tradition called Merkabah or chariot that goes back at least to the Second Temple period, if not before, and it's reflected in visions of the prophets of the Bible about the chariot of God and being taken up by it to heaven. But Kabbalah developed later under different philosophical and religious influences. So it developed in Spain, and it regards Talmud and the Book of Creation, or Sefer and Yetzirah. These works rather emphasize the mystical meanings of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So you can see the influence of Kabbalah on the Talmud, and the Kabbalah mysticism, not all of it, but a lot of it stems around interpreting Hebrew letters from the Tanakh as standing for various numbers, because this is how numbers are written in ancient Hebrew. Just like in Latin, certain letters would stand for certain numbers. But it was also influenced by Neoplatonist concepts of how God relates to the world through emanation. So this series of emanations, different like phases or intermediary steps in the creation, different levels of creation, different levels of being. And you can potentially, ascend the hierarchy back to God. Neoplatonism itself, to the extent that it was influenced by Pythagoreanism, which was another ancient Greek philosophical tradition that was a big influence on Plato, was kind of revived by the Neoplatonists in like the 4th through the 6th centuries AD, I guess you could say. Pythagoreanism had a lot of numerical mysticism. I mean, that's why they were so interested in geometry and numbers and arithmetic generally. And you can definitely see that Pythagorean influence and the numerology or number mysticism in Kabbalah. So the Zohar is a book of the Kabbalah, probably the most famous. Its name means splendor or radiance. It offers a mystical commentary on the Torah and a mystical cosmology and psychology based on Kabbalistic purposes. Kabbalah was generally only studied by a minority of Jews and under mainly Jewish men, and under the instruction of a particular teacher who was regarded as a master of the tradition and who could explain it and convey the meaning. So it's an example of an esoteric or kind of secret mystical tradition that you find within Judaism specifically. So a bit more about the Jews in medieval Spain. Early in the Middle Ages, you could say during the Dark Ages, as they're often called, Spain was entirely Muslim, but part of it was conquered under Charlemagne the Great, although he largely failed to conquer Spain. But there were a few small Christian marches or border kingdoms in the north. They gradually expanded. So by the High Middle Ages or the Middle Ages, Spain was divided between several Christian kingdoms in the north and a Muslim caliphate in the south. So the Christian kingdoms gradually expanded south, reconquering the Spanish peninsula from the Muslims. This is called the Reconquista in Spanish. And so earlier on, the Muslim Almohad dynasty which was based in North Africa, was able to also conquer Muslim Spain, and they drove out the Jews. And that shows how, although in general a lot of the Muslim caliphates and emirates and other dynasties gave toleration to the Jews, they did sporadically persecute them as well, similar to the Christian kingdoms in Europe. The Christian rulers of the various northern Spanish kingdoms at first welcomed Jews. Jews often worked as moneylenders because usury or lending at interest was forbidden to Christians, but it was an important part of the economy. And Jews were also often multilingual and so could serve as scholars and officials in the court of the Christian kings. But eventually, Jews began to be attacked by Spanish Christians, and this reached a peak in the year 1391. Many Jews converted to Christianity to escape persecution. However, they became known as marranos, or swine, by some Spanish people, as well as just by the more neutral term conversos. This culminated in 1492 when Jews were required by the monarchs of Spain to convert to Catholic Christianity or to leave Spain. So thousands of Jews fled to other parts of Europe or to the Middle East, such as Safed in Galilee. Some converted to Christianity, but still secretly practiced Judaism in the home. And they were known, or they are known, as crypto Jews or hidden Jews. A lot of these families apparently eventually kind of lost the knowledge of their Jewish identity and ancestry, even though they succeeded in transmitting across the generations some of their Jewish rituals and practices. So I've read stories of like some Spanish families and even Mexican families, because some of them later migrated to Mexico, which became a Spanish colony, New Spain, that they didn't even know that their family was Jewish, just that they thought they were Catholic, but they did some things differently. So a lot of these crypto Jews eventually, in other words, lost their knowledge of their Jewish identity. They just got really assimilated into the larger Spanish Catholic culture. There was also the Spanish Inquisition, which was a religious court that investigated heresy among the Christians. So they didn't actually have authority to investigate Jews or pressure them to convert to Christianity, but they did have authority to investigate conversos, and especially ones that were suspected of secretly still being Jewish or not having been sincere in their conversion. And some of these investigations ultimately, involve torture and just other forms of coercion. Now we're going to move to the late medieval and early Renaissance period. First, we'll start talking about Jews in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, which was ruled by a new dynasty called the Ottomans by this time. The Ottoman Empire was a Turkish dynasty, but the Ottoman Turks had converted to Islam, so they were Muslim. They were the ones to finally destroy the remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, which controlled the city of Constantinople up to the year 1453, but that was the year it was conquered by the Ottomans. They made it their capital subsequently, and the Eastern Roman Empire came to an end. They conquered Palestine in the year 1515. They conquered Egypt in 1517. They ended up ruling much of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, and they started pushing into other parts of Europe as well. They were finally stopped in Vienna in 1683, where they were defeated. and they gradually started to lose power after that. But for a long time, they were just as powerful or more powerful than any of the European kingdoms. Um, so there were Jews basically continuing to live in the Middle East under the Ottomans, similar to how they had done before under previous Muslim dynasties. The Jews in the Ottoman Empire were actually mostly Sephardic. This is because of the Jews that had been kicked out of Spain in the late 1400s. A lot of them moved to the Eastern Mediterranean where there were other kingdoms of Jews, and so they fell under the territory of the Ottoman Empire. But many of those Jews actually continued to use Ladino, or the Jewish dialect of Spanish, for example. So they retained some of their Sephardic customs. In Germany and Central Europe, the Jews spoke a dialect of German called Yiddish, which just means Jewish in the German language. So it's largely similar to High German, but it has loan words from Hebrew and some other languages as well. So Jews that are from Central Europe and Eastern Europe are called Ashkenazi. They're actually named after the Hebrew name for Germany. They had different rituals than the Sephardic Jews. And they originate actually later in the 16th century AD. That was by the time you started to get larger communities of Jews that had settled in German-speaking lands. And partly to pursue new opportunities, partly to avoid persecutions or to flee from persecutions, they gradually moved to the east into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia and other eastern parts of Europe. So most of the European Jews living in Eastern Europe were in what was then the Kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, sometimes called the Commonwealth. This was kind of like a somewhat loose association of feudal territories that had a king, but the nobility had a lot of independence who ruled the various parts of Poland, Lithuania. The Eastern European Jews, since they had migrated from German-speaking lands, they largely retained Yiddish, or their dialect of German, as their daily spoken language, as well as still knowing Hebrew and using it for their study of the scriptures and of their liturgy in the synagogue. So there were periodic anti-Jewish riots in Eastern Europe, but the rulers often protected the Jews and invited them to migrate there even because they were quite useful for money lending, trading, and just farming, other types of economic production too. Poland and Ukraine saw serious persecutions of the Jews in 1648 and in 1649 by peasants who were angry at the Jews because they associated them with their feudal lords. So there was kind of like a class-based intersection with these peasant rebels and Jews who were identified by the peasant rebels as like collaborating with the feudal lords that they had resentment against. In Italy, there were severe penalties inflicted on Jews during this period. Jews were largely segregated into ghettos, which was an Italian word that referred to a walled-off district of cities. We can also talk about the various types of Jewish scripture and literature that developed all through the Rabbinic period. In addition to the Torah and the rest of the Tanakh, there's many different texts that are used by Jews to understand their faith. And in fact, many times they will go to later commentaries first before going back to the Tanakh. There is nevertheless a kind of hierarchy of significance and authority. The Tanakh was the foundation for the Mishnah, or the oral teaching, and the Tanakh and the Mishnah together were the foundation for the Talmud. So you can say the Tanakh has priority over the Mishnah and the Tanakh have priority over the Talmud. Within the Tanakh itself, the Torah, or the Law of Moses, has priority over the prophets, and the prophetic writings in general have priority over the writings. There's also other Jewish texts that were written after the Talmud. The Targums are paraphrases or summaries of parts of the Bible. The Mishneh Torah, this is a work by the philosopher Maimonides, but it's his own summary and commentary on the Mishnah. There's also important commentaries by Rashi and Abraham ibn Ezra. There's also the Zohar, the Kabbalah text. Even though it's an esoteric tradition, it ended up having a large influence on Judaism generally, especially Hasidic Judaism, about which more later. And then another example of an important Jewish text is the Shulchan Aruch, which was written around 1565, which is a compilation of Jewish law. In the late 17th century, there were renewed expectations among many Jews of a Messiah. The main messianic movement from the late 17th century was that of Shabbatai Zevi, who lived from 1628 to 1716, and whom many Jews thought of as the Messiah at that time. His main follower or supporter was Nathan of Gaza, who lived from 1643 to 1680. Nathan called for repentance, strict asceticism or renunciation of worldly things, and mortification of the body, such as through fasting, bathing in freezing water, and constant prayer. However, the movement ended after Shabbatai was imprisoned by the Ottoman Sultan in Gallipoli in 1665. Under coercion, Shabbatai converted to Islam in 1666, which caused most of his Jewish followers to abandon him and to realize he was not the Messiah. His few remaining followers were viewed negatively by other Jews. They actually converted to a sect of Islam. There's still some of them today in the modern nation of Turkey. And after the kind of scandal of the Shabbatai Zevi incident, many later Jews turned away from messianic expectations altogether. The main exception are among some of the Hasidic Jews. Hasidim or Hasidic Judaism began in the 18th century in Poland. It was a movement of the people, you could say, in the sense that it was not led by scholars who had a lot of prestige or status within Rabbinic Judaism as a whole. It more grew from the bottom up. It was a parallel movement to Pietism and to, you could say, the general first Great Awakening movement of Protestant Christianity at this time. Pietism was a movement in German Lutheranism that also emphasized spontaneity of feeling, emotion, devotion, a more energized, passionate, spirit-filled, if you will, approach to religion. So Hasidic Judaism gave hope to Jews who were deprived or frightened. There was a lot of persecutions of Jews living in Eastern Europe, like in Poland at this time. And there was an emphasis on the individual's direct experience of the divine. So it made the kind of mystical heights promised by Kabbalah accessible to the general population of Jews and didn't emphasize long hours of Torah study as being a necessary condition for developing a close and full relationship with God. So the practice of Hasidism was more accessible to ordinary laborers. Now, many Jews would be literate in Hebrew and be able to study the Torah to a degree, but they couldn't necessarily devote large chunks of their life to it. So some of the main practices of Hasidic Judaism are ecstatic prayer, singing, and dancing, and they emphasize the emotion of joy through experiencing God. So the Baal Shem Tov was one of the main founders of Hasidic Judaism. He lived from 1700 to 1760. His name or title means master of the good name. Before he had this title, he was known as Israel ben Eliezer. He was a dynamic and charismatic teacher with a reputation for performing miracles. He was influenced by Kabbalah, especially the Zohar, and the ideas of the Kabbalah spread through much of Rabbinic Judaism, especially among the Ashkenazi Jews, because of the movement of Hasidism. So there's a term Rebbe or Zadik for a leader of a Hasidic Jewish community. The Rebbe lives a life of devotion to God. He's regarded as an intermediary between his followers and God, and his word is absolute. I'm reminded of the role of gurus or spiritual teachers in Hinduism, for example. There are many branches of Hasidism or Hasidic Judaism, each with its own Zadik. And the women in Hasidic Jewish communities tend to be subservient and to lead separate lives from the men. There's large overlap. between Hasidic Judaism and the Haredim, or the so-called ultra-Orthodox Jews. So Hasidism, although it was popular in Eastern Europe, it was opposed by the Jewish establishment, the rabbinical Jewish establishment. To a certain extent, there was an element of class struggle here between the Rebbes and the more rich and learned Jews of the day. The Gaon of Vilna, who was named Elijah ben Solomon, who lived from 1720 to 1797, he was an intellectual. He did have his own kind of like ascetic practices, but he was a great critic of Hasidic Judaism. And Hasidic Jews were often excluded or betrayed to the authorities by their rivals within the rabbinic Jewish establishment. Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who lived from 1745 to 1812, was the founder of the Chabad branch of Hasidic Judaism, and he sought to reconcile the Hasidic movement with Talmudic study. This became a more widely accepted form of Hasidic Judaism, and practically speaking today, although Hasidic Judaism does have its own, distinct approach to the religion, it also emphasizes a lot of the traditional aspects of Rabbinic Judaism with Torah and Talmud study as well. From the year 1492 and after, that was the year of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. In addition, many Jews moved to Amsterdam and in the Netherlands and later to England. And some of them after 1492 also moved to the Spanish colonies in the New World. So in other words, starting in the late Renaissance and early modern period that followed it, Jews started to spread out even more and more throughout the world. From the 17th century and after, there was a westward migration of some Jews from Poland and the Ottoman Empire, like to the Americas, for example. Some moved to other countries in Western Europe, like England or France. Many rulers welcomed Jewish immigrants because of their economic value, such as for banking and trade, which were specialized in by many Jews. Partly the reason for that historically, as mentioned earlier, is that in the Middle Ages especially, it was illegal in most nations for Christians to practice lending at interest, except in certain very circumscribed ways. So because that was actually valuable to the emerging commercial economies of Europe, Jews had a kind of niche where they were not forbidden by law to do that, and so they were able to be quite successful in finance. In the 19th century, many Jews immigrated to the Americas, and not only the United States, but also other parts of the New World, such as in Latin America. Jews in many Western nations, like in Europe, also finally became equal under the law, especially after the French Revolution that happened in 1789. There were a lot of reforms in the legal codes of France and other countries along the principles of the Enlightenment, which emphasized a lot of new modern political ideas like liberty and equality under the law. So as the 19th century progressed, the idea of having all citizens treated equally under the law started to spread, and Jews were included under that. Previously, there had been special law codes governing the Jews, often restricting them. And so when Jews became equal under the law to non-Jews, this became known as emancipation. So a bit more about the various Jewish ethnicities that developed in the period of Rabbinic Judaism. Ashkenazim, or Ashkenazic Jews, are originally from France and Germany. The main population was from Germany. That's why they spoke Yiddish, a dialect of German. And eventually many of them moved east. Not all of them, but many moved to Poland and Russia. In Russia, they were only allowed to settle in a specific area called the Pale of Settlement. They were named after Minhag Ashkenaz, which was a name in Hebrew for Germany. And as mentioned, they spoke Yiddish, a dialect of German that ended up incorporating some Hebrew loanwords, as well as those from Polish and I think other languages as well. The Sephardim, or Sephardic Jews, were from Spain, named after Sepharad, the Hebrew word for Spain. They spoke Ladino, a dialect of Spanish. They were driven out of Spain in 1492 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, and many of them ended up migrating to the Ottoman Empire. The Mizrahim or Mizrahic Jews are from the Middle East and North Africa, such as Yemen, Iraq, and Morocco. And they have all of these different types of Jews have their own unique traditional languages and customs, even though they generally all practice forms of Rabbinic Judaism. One of the main exceptions to not practicing Rabbinic Judaism is the Beta Israel. They're a group of Jews from Ethiopia. They largely claim descent from an ancient population of Jews that lived on the Nile River in southern Egypt. But they have largely migrated to the modern nation of Israel, as have a lot of the other types of Jews. However, they're quite distinct from Rabbinic Judaism because they don't have the Mishnah or the Talmud as part of their practice. They are based just on the Tanakh, and so you could say, in a sense, they practice a more ancient form of Judaism. Now we're going to discuss Jewish practices, including those associated with the home, synagogue, and festivals. Maimonides, in his 13 Principles of the Faith, emphasizes three main themes in Judaism: creation, revelation, and redemption. One way of understanding the central practices of Judaism is that they fall under the theme of redemption, of Jews redeeming themselves as the chosen people of God, and in a way the creation, through following the festivals and observances mandated by the Torah and Talmud. Many or most Jews practice their religion through participating in festivals. There's a major Jewish festival almost every month of the year, and the cycle of the festivals reenacts the history of Jews, telling their story and allowing Jews to connect with it. Everyday observances are mainly of the mitzvot or commandments. The Babylonian Talmud says that the supreme moment of revelation was when Moses received the commandments or mitzvot on Mount Sinai. So this is something that in a way is emphasized more in Rabbinic Judaism than it was in earlier Judaism. But even in the ancient form of the religion, the Jews kind of affirmed their role as the chosen people of God, which was their whole identity as a people and as a religion, through practicing the commandments revealed to Moses on Sinai. So it's always been part of the essence of the faith. Halakha means following or observing the mitzvot, the commandments, walking in God's way or the path that God commanded for the Jews. More recently, especially as emphasized in the Kabbalah and Hasidic Judaism and other types of Judaism that have been influenced by those traditions, humans can be thought of as partnering with God in the task of repairing the world, which in Kabbalah is depicted as having been shattered in some way through the energies of God's creation. The picture on the slide is of a common Jewish custom, the Sabbath or Shabbat candles, and challah or braided bread that's eaten on Friday evening at the beginning of the Sabbath. So there are many customs that are celebrated routinely at home and also at the synagogue, especially connected with Shabbat or Sabbath. Shabbat is the seventh day of the week. It's a day of rest where work is not allowed. The holy significance of the Sabbath is actually established in the creation story in Genesis, the first book of the Torah, because God is depicted as having created the world in 7 days, but resting on the seventh. So it's a 6-day creation. The seventh day is actually God resting, and that's connected to the later commandment revealed to Moses, really a series of commandments about how to respect the Sabbath. The Sabbath begins on Friday evening and ends Saturday evening because in the Jewish tradition, days begin at nightfall rather than, for example, at dawn. Jews will traditionally attend synagogue Friday evening, but also Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon to celebrate the Sabbath. Synagogues are referred to as shul, which means school, because they originated as places for study of the Torah. The Torah is also involved in the rituals performed in the synagogue to honor the Sabbath. The scroll of the law, or Sefer Torah, is held in a protective ark or container in the synagogue, and it's removed during services to be read from. Some of the customs that are followed by Jews at home: there are ceremonies connected to Shabbat, so lighting candles, reciting blessings over the wine and braided bread. There's also kosher dietary laws that dictate, for example, how to prepare food, what foods are regarded as unclean and to be avoided, and so on. There are major festivals such as the Passover Seder that are celebrated at home. Seder is a ritual meal. So, for example, Jews are not allowed to eat pork or shellfish or birds of prey. There's a whole list of types of animals that are regarded as unclean. But there are other laws too about how to prepare the food, such as not mixing meat and dairy. Children sometimes participate in these ceremonies and even play a special role. In the festival of Purim, for example, children are supposed to yell out and drown out the name of Haman, the villain, whenever it's spoken. During Passover, a child asks questions at the Seder at home, and there's a formula in which the answers are read. And the question and answer tell the story of the Passover, which is connected to the origin of Judaism and the Jewish people. And in the festival of Hanukkah, children are often closest to the lights of the menorah or candelabra when it is lit. So first, we're going to go over the three main pilgrimage festivals, and then the other festivals, or some of the other festivals celebrated in Judaism. The pilgrimage festivals are so named because in ancient Judaism, they were the three annual occasions when Jews were expected to make the journey to the temple in Jerusalem to worship and sacrifice. Pesach, or Passover, lasts for 8 days. The 15th through the 21st or 22nd of the Hebrew month of Nisan. Judaism uses a lunar calendar, so the actual dates of the months of the Hebrew calendar will vary on the modern solar calendar. The Pesach, or Passover festival, commemorates the exodus from Egypt under Moses. It's named after the angel of God passing over the homes of the Hebrews that were marked with the blood of the slaughtered lamb when the angel of God was going around and killing the firstborn males of the Egyptians. Pesach in general celebrates the passage of the ancient Hebrews and thus the Israelites from slavery to freedom. You can see it rooted in chapter 13, verse 8 of the book of Exodus in the Torah. So one of the main customs of Pesach is the Seder, or ritual meal, which is eaten at the home. It occurs on the first evening of the 8-day feast. It's a family meal with a retelling of the story taken from the Haggadah, or a text that is the telling, quote unquote, of the story of Passover. And there's also many symbolic elements of the Seder. For example, unleavened bread, or matzot, that is consumed by people sharing the meal. This is based on the fact that in the Exodus, the Hebrews are described as not being able to wait for their bread to rise from the yeast before baking it, and so they basically ate flat bread after they left Egypt. In the ancient temple in ancient Judaism, there was animal sacrifice, specifically a sin offering made during Pesach, but no longer since the destruction of the temple. The second of the pilgrimage festivals is Shavuot, also called Pentecost, which is on the 6th day of the month of Sivan. It marks the bringing of the first fruits of the harvest to the temple, so it was an ancient harvest festival. It celebrates as well the giving of the Torah by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. And then there's the festival of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, which lasts for 8 days, the 15th through the 20th of the month of Tishrei. And it commemorates God's protection of the Israelites when they were wandering in the wilderness after they had left Egypt and before they had come to the Promised Land. The tabernacles are symbolic of the tents that the Hebrews lived in, although if you look at modern interpretations of the holiday, it's also believed to relate to an ancient Israelite agricultural festival where the shepherds would be kind of in little huts in the fields looking after their livestock during that particular part of the year. You can see multiple meanings, by the way, of some of these different festivals. They may have had a different origin historically from how they're interpreted by Judaism today. Usually the interpretation today is based on particular stories in the Torah. Rosh Hashanah is another festival. It's on the first and second days of the month of Tishrei. It is the Jewish New Year festival, and it's part of a 40-day period of penitence. Specifically, Rosh Hashanah marks the beginning of the 10 days of awe, the Yamim Noraim, which are the last 10 days of the 40-day penitence period. On New Year's Eve, there's a meal eaten, including foods associated with sweetness, blessings, and plenty. Bread, for example, is dipped in honey rather than in salt. There's also a prayer, may it be your will to renew for us a good and sweet year. So the theme of sweetness is prominent. There's also a morning service on New Year's Day. There can be up to 6 hours of prayer. The service focuses on God's role as creator, king, and judge. But God is also said to show mercy to those who sincerely turn toward him. One of the other famous aspects of the Rosh Hashanah festival is the blowing of the shofar, or ram's horn. This is blown throughout the service to act as a wake-up call. And you can see this relates to the biblical verse in the book of Amos, chapter 3, verse 6. I recommend checking out a video or recording of the blowing of a shofar. It's a very interesting sound. Kind of like, a trumpet or other horn, but this would have been used in ancient Judaism. The festival of Yom Kippur is on the 10th day of the month of Tishrei. It is the Day of Atonement. It marks the end of the 10 days of awe. It is the holiest day in the Jewish liturgical or ritual year. On Yom Kippur, Jews solemnly review their conduct over the past year and turn towards the upcoming new year. The day is spent in prayer for forgiveness and for a good year ahead. There's the theme of Teshuvah, or return to God, which is a renewed commitment to follow God's commandments. Part of the celebration of Yom Kippur is the Kol Nidre. This is a declaration in the Aramaic language, which was spoken by ancient Jews for a while when they lived in Judea. It's sung during the beginning of the synagogue service on Yom Kippur. There are special prohibitions for Yom Kippur. It's forbidden to work as on the Shabbat. And there's also the Inuyim, 5 additional prohibitions that are not common to normal Shabbat days. This is abstaining from, number 1, eating and drinking. Number 2, anointing with oil. Number 3, sex. Number 4, washing for pleasure. And number 5, wearing leather shoes. And the end of the Yom Kippur is the Ne'ilah, or closing of the gates. This is the final service as the end of the fasting period is approached, and it's regarded by Jews as the last hour in which the gates of heaven remain open for the annual return to God. And another very beautiful part of Yom Kippur is the Avinu Malkeinu, or Our Father, Our King, which is chanted to express commitment to God, and there's a final blowing of the shofar. And then there are many festivals that could be considered of relatively minor importance, at least in terms of religion, although they often have a very big cultural significance in Judaism. One of these festivals is Hanukkah, or the Festival of Lights. It used to be called in ancient times the Festival of Dedication, because it commemorates the rededication of the temple in 165 BC after it had been defiled by the Greek king Antiochus IV through the abomination of desolation. It's celebrated from the 25th of the month of Kislev to the 2nd of the month of Tevet. And it commemorates not only that event, but a miracle that occurred during the rededication. The Hasmoneans could only find enough oil in the temple to light the menorah or candelabra for one day, and yet the oil sufficed for 8 days of illumination. So that's why it's an 8-day festival. The way it's celebrated is Jews will have a menorah in their home, and one additional light or candle on the menorah is lit for each night of the festival. Purim is celebrated on the 14th day of the month of Adar. It commemorates an event after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, but during the Babylonian captivity before the second temple was built. It involves a story of the court of the Persian king or emperor Ahasuerus and one of his officials named Haman, who was scheming to try to kill all of the Jews. However, there was a Jewish woman named Esther who was also a favorite of the Persian king Ahasuerus, and her uncle Mordecai was a very pious man. Together, they are used by God to prevent Haman's proposed massacre. And the festival is very joyous. It's celebrated with parties, gifts, costumes, noisemakers, and just a lot of revelry. So one of the other customs of Purim is reading from the Megillah, or the scroll that contains the book of Esther. This Megillah contains some other readings that are used throughout the liturgical year in synagogue. Hamantashen, or hats of Haman, are also eaten traditionally on Purim. Another fast day is Tisha B'Av, or the 9th day of Av. This commemorates the destruction of the first temple in the year 586 BC by the Babylonians, and of the second temple by the Romans in the year 70 AD. And it's also often held to commemorate other tragedies of Jewish history. For example, in Reform Judaism, it's interpreted as a commemoration of the Holocaust as well. On the festivals of Yom Kippur as well as Tisha B'Av, the fast lasts for 25 hours rather than the 24 hours required for other fast days. And in Judaism, fasting includes abstaining from drink as well as food. Some Jews, especially in the Reform tradition, may only fast for Yom Kippur specifically, but Orthodox Jews have multiple fast days throughout the year. Now we're going to talk about modern Judaism, basically its history over the last couple hundred years. The Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, grew out of the larger Enlightenment movement in 18th century Europe. This was a cultural movement mainly led by the nobility and the other elites in the society, like educated or at least middle class people that were literate and so on. And this movement advocated science and reason and freedom of thought rather than just relying on church teaching or scripture or other religious traditions. A lot of the people involved in the Enlightenment were actually religious, but they were thinking of themselves as relying on modern ways of knowing rather than just kind of like blindly or unthinkingly or in a biased fashion sticking to traditions, whether religious or otherwise. And they had a lot of political ideas as well, political liberalism, as we might term it nowadays, and to a certain extent back then. So they were questioning traditional structures of authority, not only churches, but also monarchies, aristocracies, other hierarchies. They tended to advocate individual liberty, equality under the law, constitutional government, so like a written constitution that guaranteed certain rights to different people, certain powers to parts of government, rather than just having a customary constitution. And even in the arts and literature, there were aspects of this movement. In the arts, there was a revival of ancient Roman and ancient Greek styles of art, or at least the 18th century interpretation of them. That can be called neoclassical style. And this even influenced styles of musical composition. For example, the composer Mozart. So the Jewish Enlightenment, or Haskalah, grows out of this larger movement. Other famous historical events that emerge out of the Enlightenment are the American Revolution in 1776 and the French Revolution in 1789, which goes on to spark other revolutions in the 1800s. But as far as the Jewish Enlightenment goes, the initiator of it was Moses Mendelssohn, who lived from 1729 to 1786. He was an intellectual who lived in Germany of Jewish ancestry. So he was a Jew, but he advocated a sort of modernized approach to Judaism. He advocated, first of all, politically separating religion from the state so that religion would become a matter of the private conscience of the individual rather than something that had a legal status, either an official church or otherwise being heavily regulated by the government or the state. He also emphasized the universal principles within Judaism, thus kind of downplaying the theological and other differences between Judaism and Christianity or other religions, such as Jews and Christians both believing in one God, etc. And he translated the Torah from Hebrew into German. So traditionally, Jews throughout the world, even though they would have different languages they would use in daily life, both within their own communities and in communicating with the wider society they're a part of, they always used Hebrew to study the Torah. And they typically would even use the Hebrew script or alphabet to write other languages that they might have spoke, such as Yiddish or Ladino. But Moses Mendelssohn was advocating for other German Jews like him to assimilate into German society, at least to some degree. Another key figure in the Jewish Enlightenment, this one from the 19th century, was Leopold Zunz, who lived from 1794 to 1886. So he rejected the Talmud and a lot of traditional ideas in Rabbinic Judaism, and he even rejected the idea of revelation, i.e. the notion of the literal truth and reliability of the Tanakh or the scriptures, emphasizing Judaism as a cultural identity, at least to a degree. A bit more about the history of the Jews in the 19th century. So because of the revolutionary political ideals of the Enlightenment, these had a big influence on politics and revolutions and even warfare, like Napoleon's wars across Europe in the early 19th century, which spread the ideals of the French Revolution to a large degree and of the Enlightenment. These led to political changes in a lot of the nations of Europe, starting in the West, but kind of moving around as the century progressed. So as a consequence of this, many Jews were emancipated or given legal equality. So that happened in France, Italy, and Germany in the 19th century. Previously, in Italy, for example, Jews were required to live in a ghetto in many cities or a walled off part of the city that Jews had to return to each night. And as the 19th century progressed, many Jews began to assimilate into the nations that they lived in, and some married non-Jews as well. The 19th century saw the origins of Reform Judaism. This was a new approach to the religion that lessened the large number of observances and traditions of traditional or Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism and sought to kind of make Judaism a bit more compatible, not only with the larger society, so there's kind of an assimilationist aspect of Reform Judaism, but also just to make it more compatible with modern ways of thinking, like those derived from the Enlightenment, the worldview of modern science, modern political ideas like liberty and equality, and so forth. But also during the 19th century, there were many reactionary ideas as well, I guess you could phrase them. Partly, oddly, these are emerging out of the Enlightenment and the Romantic movement of the early 1800s, which tended to identify national identity or ethnicity as the basis for identity in general, rather than traditional religious identity. And some of these ideologies ended up coming up with mythologies of race and ethnicity, and that kind of fed into anti-Semitism. So the anti-Semitic racial philosophies that were new to the 19th century were different from just old anti-Semitism that was more rooted in religious conflict between Christians and Jews. So the new forms were based in part on the Romantic belief of a spirit of a nation or a people, or Volksgeist in German. And the Romantic movement was partly a reaction against the Enlightenment, partly an outgrowth of it. The Enlightenment tended to emphasize universal reason and universal human nature. The Romantics were emphasizing the distinctness of each people, but they defined people usually along linguistic community lines or on racial lines increasingly as the century progressed. The Jews, who were of Semitic ancestry, you could say, were often contrasted with Europeans who were of Aryan or Slavonic ancestry. The Aryan terminology really came in later in the 19th century. It was based in part on sort of a misinterpretation of the ancient Aryans from India and Iran, who did migrate there from Eurasia, probably parts of Central Asia originally, and so we're kind of distantly, linguistically, and perhaps racially related to other Central Asian nomads that migrated into Europe as well. But there was kind of a mistaken notion that identified the Aryans as like the original white race or something like that, kind of making a couple mistakes. One, conflating an ethno-linguistic group with a racial group. I mean, there's overlap, obviously, but they're not equivalent concepts. And then also kind of assuming that the Aryans were the first people that spoke Indo-European languages, and that's also not true. And then in terms of the Slavonic racial concept, that was used by a lot of Eastern Europeans who spoke Slavic languages, and they were trying to create their own kind of national identities and myths, if you will. And that happened in Russia and other countries in Eastern Europe, but they looked at Jews as not part of their nation, as foreigners, and that could feed into anti-Semitic attitudes. The more extreme forms of anti-Semitism developed in France and Germany from the 1880s and on, so like pretty late in the 1800s. These racialist forms of anti-Semitism pretty obviously contributed to the Holocaust in Nazi Germany from 1939 to 1945. There's different estimates of the numbers, but millions of Jews were killed, as well as a lot of other people. But Jews specifically were targeted because they were regarded as racial enemies of the German people. But you can kind of see these ideas develop across the 1800s. Ironically, even as the Enlightenment ideals of human equality and emancipation for Jews and other minorities are also spreading throughout the continent. Reform Judaism develops. It emerged primarily in Germany during the late 18th century out of that Jewish Enlightenment, but it especially started to grow during the 19th century. Reform Judaism emphasizes reason and social progress. In the 19th century, they advocated for emancipation for the Jews. Many Jews assimilated into European society during this time, but in Reform Judaism, they emphasized the ethical teaching of the prophets rather than ritual observance of the law. So they are for Jews keeping their own identity, but they have a kind of modernized interpretation of the practice of Judaism as a religion. Abraham Geiger, who lived from 1810 to 1874, was one of the foundational figures in Reform Judaism. He argued that the Torah is not completely factually accurate. In other words, he argued against biblical inerrancy. He abandoned dietary laws. Most Reform Jews today do not follow all the traditional rules of kosher, for example, that are followed by Orthodox Jews. And he advocated for changes in ritual and in worship, such as translating prayers from Hebrew into local languages, like German, for example, having an organ in the synagogue, which was similar to how Christian worship services were conducted with that type of music, a shorter Sabbath service, and he ended sex segregation in the synagogue. An Orthodox or traditional forms of Rabbinic Judaism, men sit in a separate section from women. Isaac Wise, who lived from 1819 to 1900, was an important figure in the Reform movement in the United States. He founded a reform organization in the United States and also Hebrew Union College in 1875, which became the main place in the U.S. for training rabbis in the Reform tradition. So women rabbis have been ordained at the Hebrew Union College since the 1970s. Another stark contrast between Reform Judaism and Orthodox or traditional Rabbinic Judaism. So Orthodox Judaism, the term didn't get developed until I think the early 1900s, but it can be used to refer to just the various traditional forms of Rabbinic Judaism that continued the practice of those traditions distinct from the Reform Jews starting in the early 19th century. So what are some of the distinctive practices of Orthodox Judaism as opposed to Reform? Daily Torah study, following all of the commandments or mitzvot as based on the Talmud and other traditional texts, following all the dietary laws, praying 3 times a day, having sex segregation in the synagogue, and purification ceremonies for women when they're at the end of their menstrual cycle. A famous sort of like founder of Orthodoxy in the 19th century was Rabbi Samson Hirsch, who lived from 1808 to 1888. He didn't, start Rabbinic Judaism, but he had an influence specifically on the modern form of Orthodoxy. In other words, he encouraged Jews to pursue secular university education and thus to partially adapt themselves to the modern world, but while still retaining Torah study and keeping all of the traditional commandments. So in other words, having a foot in the modern world, going to school, for example, to become a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or whatever, a scientist, but also still keeping all of the commandments and the focus on Torah study of traditional Rabbinic Judaism. There's also the Haredim, who in English are called the ultra-Orthodox, and they believe, unlike the modern Orthodox, in more of a separation from the modern world. So they often have their own schools that they go to. They have greater sex segregation. They tend to dress in a very traditional way. They may oppose going to school for a secular university education, etc. Haredim of Sephardic ancestry often support Zionism and the modern state of Israel, whereas those of Ashkenazi ancestry often oppose Zionism in Israel. So we'll talk more about the Zionist movement and the state of Israel in a moment, but this just illustrates how even among the Haredim there are a lot of divisions. A lot of people aren't aware of the fact that the more traditional Haredim, at least among the Ashkenazi, are actually critical of Israel. The picture on the slide is of Haredim girls praying at the Western Wall in Jerusalem. This is basically the last physical remnant of the Second Temple. So it's used as a place of worship by many Jews. And you can see how they're all dressed in a very kind of traditional conservative way. These particular group are coming from a school probably, and it's a uniform. But even apart from that, there's a very distinct style of dress that would be done by Haredim that you won't see as much in modern Orthodox. And then there's the Hasidic Jews or Hasidim. So this whole movement, as we discussed previously, was founded by the Baal Shem Tov, and it includes the emphasis on joyful worship involving song and dance. There are many sects of Hasidic Jews, each led by its own Rebbe or Rev. Some Hasidic men wear distinctive clothing like long black coats, hats, and earlocks or hair coming from their ear that's longer. Some Hasidim are also Haredim, ultra-Orthodox. There's a lot of overlap between the two. Conservative Judaism originated in the late 19th century among some European Jews who were rejecting the more liberal or radical elements of Reform Judaism. So they wanted to emphasize the historical elements of the Jewish tradition, but without retaining all of the practices of Orthodox Judaism. They thought of themselves as kind of a middle way between modern Orthodoxy and Reform Judaism. They are generally more supportive of Zionism than of the Ashkenazi Haredim. They are a larger element in North American Judaism than in Israel or the United Kingdom. So Solomon Schechter, who lived from 1847 to 1915, was essentially the founder of the conservative Judaism movement, at least in the United States. And he was the first president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where conservative Jewish rabbis are trained. There is, however, a large amount of variation in local congregations of conservative Judaism because there's often a large role in governments by lay people. Some conservative congregations use organs, like in Reform synagogues. Some emphasize keeping dietary laws, while others do not. During the 19th century, there was kind of a gradual rise overall in anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews in Europe. Anti-Semitism can be defined as a systematic bias or discrimination against Jews. An example of anti-Semitism were the pogroms. These were violent riots aimed at massacring or expelling Jews. They were common in the Russian Empire, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And they were kind of religious in character, but also ethnic. The Jews were often accused of exploiting the local peoples, and so they could be kind of connected to that older Eastern European custom or tradition, if you will, of identifying the Jews as like collaborating with the ruling class or just scheming on their own to exploit the common people. But as you can see from the picture on the slide, there were just a lot of horrible murders, including of women and children. The persecution of the Jews that was largest in scale was the Holocaust, or Shoah as it's sometimes known by Jews. This is the mass murder of Jews perpetrated by the Nazi regime in Germany under Adolf Hitler. Millions of Jews died during the Nazi rule and the wars that engulfed Europe at the time. Jews were deprived of their property. They were sent to large camps, concentration camps. Many of them died there from starvation, overwork, or were deliberately killed by the Nazis. So it was a very devastating effect for European Jews. The persecution of Jews in the 19th century and the whole long history of their intermittent persecution in Europe was one of the main influences on Zionism. This was a movement that sought to establish a modern homeland for Jews. So one of the main motives for that was many Jews in the late 19th century began to think that Jews would not be safe, they would not be protected from persecution or discrimination unless they had their own nation state. This movement was also somewhat influenced by European nationalist movements that were growing to prominence in the 19th century. A lot of the founders of Zionism were actually not particularly Orthodox or religious Jews. In fact, they tended to be more politically progressive or socialist, secular, and nationalist. So many of them saw Judaism as an ethnic identity. But nevertheless, there were other religious Jews attracted to the movement too, in large part because of the idea of a homeland for the Jews where they would be safe from discrimination and persecution. So there were different places that were proposed as potential areas that Jews could make into their homeland. But by the late 19th century, Palestine, which was then under Ottoman and then British control after 1918, became the main hub of Zionism. So many Jews began moving to Palestine under Ottoman rule in the late 1800s. and they continued there when Palestine was transferred under British control in 1918. In addition to some Orthodox Jews settling in Palestine, including a lot of Ashkenazi Jews, there were many secular and socialist Jews, and they had a big impact on the culture of later Israel. Early on, they created communal farms, or kibbutzim, which were organized along socialist principles. One of the main founders of the ideology of Zionism was Theodor Herzl, who lived from 1860 to 1904, and he's an example of one of those more secular Jews. But even for the secular Jews, they essentially regard their Judaism as their cultural identity, and that's the way it is today for many Jews, even those who are not Orthodox in their religion. Judaism can also be another type of identity, similar to an ethnicity or nationality. So let's talk a bit about the modern state of Israel. It was established in 1948 as part of a UN agreement. There was a decision by Britain to give up the territory of Palestine after the end of World War II, which ended in 1945. The United Kingdom of Great Britain had promised both a homeland for the Jews in Palestine and for the Arabs there. And so they partitioned Palestine, again, under UN guidance, you might say, or oversight in 1948, into these two territories. One that would be a majority Jewish and the other majority Arab. And most of the Arabs were Muslim with a Christian minority. Jews from around the whole world were settling in Israel in the 20th century, especially after its founding. And Israel was created as a secular parliamentary democracy, but with a large Jewish majority. So immediately after the State of Israel was proclaimed in 1948, it was invaded by many of its Arab neighbors, including Egypt, Syria, Transjordan, and Iraq. A lot of these were newly independent nations that had previously been under British or French administration after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. And Israel was able to withstand destruction despite the fact that it was invaded by so many foes. This is the War of Independence. It lasted from the 15th of May to the 10th of June in 1948. You can see the main advances into Israel on the map on the slide. And so a ceasefire was declared a year after. And then there were a series of other wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors in the decades after 1948. Two of the most important were the Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. The Six-Day War started after Egypt had announced it would cut off shipping to Israel via the Straits of Tiran. Israel thus launched a preemptive strike against Egypt to prevent that happening. And Israel was able to defeat a coalition of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and even other Arab states. And they gained a lot of territory, including the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, which previously was the heart of the Arab partition part of Palestine, and the Golan Heights, overlooking southern Syria and Lebanon. So the Sinai Peninsula was given back to Egypt eventually, but Israel retained a lot of its other territory. And then in the Yom Kippur War in 1973, there was an invasion of Israel by Egypt, Syria, and a coalition of other Arab states. But again, Israel was able to defeat all of the enemy belligerents. The war is named after the fact that they invaded Israel on the holiest day of the Jewish religion, which is Yom Kippur. There are many conflicts in the modern nation of Israel, including religious, ethnic, and various types of political conflicts. Religiously, there are conflicts between secular Jews and Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews. The secular Jews were the originally dominant class. They largely were the ones who founded the nation of Israel, created its institutions and a lot of its parties. But the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, they tend to have larger families. That's one of the reasons they're growing at a relatively larger rate, population-wise, than secular Jews. And so that's partly reflected in increased political power as well. In terms of ethnic conflicts, the main type of Jews that established Israel were Ashkenazi Jews. They were the founders of the Zionist movement. And so they had, again, a kind of disproportionate influence on the founding, but also in the national culture of Israel. To this day, there are some Jews, Orthodox Jews of other ethnicities that have partially assimilated into the Ashkenazi customs of Rabbinic Judaism, including like how they dress and things like that. But there are other Jews like the Sephardic Jews, the Mizrahi Jews or Middle Eastern Jews, and Ethiopian Jews, Beta Israel, that sometimes have conflicts with the Ashkenazi because of ethnic differences. Especially the Beta Israel are considered not real Jews by some of the other Jews because they are not from that same rabbinic tradition, as well as the fact that they're of Ethiopian ancestry. And then there are some conflicts surrounding Zionism. Some of the more traditional religious Orthodox Jews among the Haredim most often oppose Zionism and even the state of Israel itself. This is sometimes shocking for non-Jews when they learn this. They're a minority in Israel, but they're still a significant voice. And many ultra-Orthodox Jews don't serve in the Israeli Defense Forces because they're allowed an exemption to study the Torah rather than to have to serve in the army. But this is actually, there's been a recent proposal of changing that law, in part because of the current struggle between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip as of the time of this recording in May of 2024. And then another example of politics in modern Israel is the Gush Emunim, or Bloc of the Faithful. They're a fundamentalist Jewish group that were founded in 1974. They're a bit unusual in that they're, extremely religious, but they are very pro-Zionist. So they claim a divine right to settle in the West Bank that's mainly occupied by Palestinian Arabs, and in the Gaza Strip and in the Golan Heights as well. Another example of progressive Judaism is the Renewal movement. This has roots in the 1960s counterculture. It attempts to renew Judaism by drawing from Jewish mysticism, Hasidism, music, and meditative traditions, essentially combining ideas from Western New Age spirituality with aspects of Judaism. Now we're going to switch gears a bit and talk about some other more liberal or progressive forms of Judaism that developed in the 20th century. So one of them is Reconstructionist Judaism, which started as an outgrowth of conservative Judaism, but then went much in a more radical direction. It was founded by Mordecai Kaplan, who lived from 1881 to 1983. He regarded Judaism as an evolving culture, and he gave equal weight to the ethical and cultural aspects of Judaism, not just the religious aspects. It's mainly been practiced in the United States since the 1960s. So it's a very liberal or progressive form of Judaism. It was the first to adopt inclusive language, gender inclusive language, having women participating in the liturgy, and, for example, welcoming single-parent families to synagogue. Even though it's quite progressive, they have taken some ideas from traditional Judaism, like Tikkun Olam, or repair of the world, which actually comes from Kabbalah, where I mentioned this briefly previously, that there's a notion from Kabbalah of humans participating in the repairing of the shattered vessels of the world that were shattered through the transmission of the divine energies that occurred during the creation. So it's a very kind of mystical concept from Kabbalah. As it's interpreted by Reconstructionist Judaism, it's interpreted as having Jews advocating social justice as their way of repairing the world. And then there's humanistic Judaism. This is a secularized approach to Judaism that dates to around 1965. So they identify as Jews but reject a lot of the traditional religious aspects of Judaism. They deny belief in the supernatural. They regard the Exodus story as a myth and many other stories of the Tanakh. They rarely use the word God, and they actually accept people of any ancestry, not just those from Jewish families. The main humanistic Jewish organization is the International Federation of Secular Humanistic Jews. Now we're going to go over some examples of how Judaism in general has changed some of its beliefs and practices in modern times. Since the 19th century, it's fair to say that many Jews have questioned some of their traditional beliefs. In particular, modern Jews, even those who identify as Orthodox, are often skeptical or agnostic about the coming of the Messiah and traditional Jewish eschatology. There is an ancient tradition of that goes back to the prophets of the Tanakh, but you might say sort of culturally, it's just sort of downplayed in a lot of modern forms of Judaism. There's a saying, when the Messiah comes, but it's often given with the connotation of it's not going to happen or never. Disappointment after previous failed messiahs, such as in antiquity, Bar Kokhba, more recently Sabbatai Zevi, are partly behind the downplaying of the expectations for the Messiah and also of the afterlife. In terms of Reform Judaism, there's a general rejection of a lot of literal interpretations of the scripture and an abandoning of some Jewish traditions, such as the kosher laws and other traditional observances, but many Reform Jews still have a very strong identity as Jews. In terms of Reconstructionist and Humanistic Judaism, they're more radical still because they generally reject all supernatural elements of Jewish tradition. The Holocaust, the mass killing of Jews by the Nazi regime, as mentioned previously, had a big impact on Judaism. It caused many Jews to question whether God exists or whether there's a divine providence governing the world, because it seemed like such a horrible crime was permitted by God to be perpetrated on the Jewish people. Having said all that, many Jews remain Orthodox, whether modern Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. In the state of Israel, Orthodox rabbis actually have a lot more influence than Reform Judaism. Reform Judaism and the various other more liberal or progressive forms of Judaism are generally more influential in the United States. They do exist in Israel, but the Orthodox rabbis have more of a legal and cultural status. And in terms of demographics, the Haredim or ultra-Orthodox have the highest birth rates in Israel. They have the largest families. So they're actually growing as a proportion of the population. A bit more about modern Jewish religious life. So people can go to study the Torah at rabbinical seminaries. Rabbis are the modern clergy of Rabbinic Judaism, and each type of Judaism, such as Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative, will have their own seminaries for training their rabbis. There's been a spread throughout Judaism, not only in Hasidic Judaism, but also in Reform, of the notion of tikkun olam, or repairing or mending the world. And that just gets interpreted differently in different types of Judaism. The more progressive Jews will interpret that as advocating for human rights, political activism, and social justice causes. The ancient Jewish prophets were involved in social justice in the sense that they decried the iniquities of their kings or others that ruled them in positions of power. So there is a kind of ancient and even religious aspect to Jewish advocacy for social justice movements, but it's taken, in kind of like different political directions. It varies, but generally Jews that are more Orthodox or traditional are going to be more politically conservative, whereas those that are more on the Reform end of the spectrum are going to be more politically liberal. There's been a diversity of opinion in Rabbinic Judaism since the beginning. You can see this in the Talmud with the responsa literature. There are different rulings given by different rabbis, and that's retained in the Babylonian Talmud. Even within the same sect or branch of Judaism, there can be multiple schools of thought. There's a saying where you have two Jews, you will have three opinions. I mean, to a certain extent, that's true of all people and all religions, but perhaps because of the responsa literature and the preservation of disagreements among rabbinic authorities in the Talmud and other rabbinic texts, that is even more pronounced in Judaism than in other religions. And a bit about Jewish identity. On the Orthodox view, to be a Jew, you have to be born to a Jewish mother, or you have to go through a formal process of conversion to Judaism. In the Reform Jewish view, a person is a Jew if at least one of their parents is Jewish and if they are raised in a Jewish community, or if they convert to Judaism at some point, albeit according to the criteria of Reform Judaism rather than Orthodox. As mentioned since the beginning, the term Judaism can refer to an ethnicity, not just to a religion. Many people who are ethnically Jewish in modern times are no longer religious. In the state of Israel, more than 50% of Jews identify as secular, although, as mentioned, the proportion of the population that's ultra-Orthodox is growing for demographic reasons. In the United States, about half of Jews do not belong to a synagogue or temple, and thus, effectively speaking, they're not practicing their religion, you could say. In terms of modern Jewish populations, worldwide there's 15.7 million Jews as of 2023. They're only 0.2% of the world population, but they've had a huge impact on science, culture, the arts, etc. In the state of Israel, as of 2023, the population of Jews is about 7.2 million. They're a large majority, about 73.2% of the population, but there's still a relatively significant population of non-Jews, mainly Arabs who live in the state of Israel. And then in the United States, there are 7.6 million Jews as of the year 2020, and they form only 2.4% of the population of the US, but it's the largest population in a single country outside of Israel, and indeed larger than the number of Jews in Israel. Jewish contributions to modern science and culture are quite noteworthy. So despite their small numbers, they have been prominent in sciences, arts, literature, media, entertainment, law, and politics. And there could be various reasons for this. One is that because with Rabbinic Judaism, their religion was so highly focused on studying the Torah, Jews had higher rates of literacy than a lot of other populations through the early modern era, and so they may have had a kind of educational or literacy head start over some other people. But I mean, there could be different theories of exactly why this is the case. What about the future of Judaism? In the United States and many other nations where there are a lot of freedoms given to Jews than in past centuries, this has actually led to assimilation. This is actually not a new historical process. There were, for example, ancient Jews who lived in China, but in part because they were so well treated there or tolerated, they just assimilated into the population. At least that's the way the story is often told. It makes sense, though. We can see a similar process happening now in the US and other countries. Many Jews don't marry, or if they do marry, they marry someone who's not Jewish, and so there's at least a good chance they won't raise their kids with their religion. Or they may be secular, and even if they identify as Jewish in some sense, they don't maintain the traditions. And so when that happens, it gradually tends to die out, both the identity and the religion. However, there is a rise of religious Jews in Israel because the secular Jews there have lower birth rates than both the modern Orthodox and the Haredim. And of late, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism against Jews, in part because of the polarizing nature of the state of Israel and its relation to treatment of the Arabs who live in the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, or you could say Palestine. The terminology gets problematic and divisive, but safe to say that there's just a lot of conflicts between the state of Israel and its neighbors. So that's it for my survey of Judaism. Next up in the World Religions playlist is going to be number 10, a survey of Christianity. Until next time.